I loved my wife so much that when she went on a fishing trip with friends, I decided to surprise her. What I saw through the cabin window kept me speechless for 15 minutes. Before I explain how I destroyed their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a harsh lesson to someone who mistook your silence for weakness. My name is Edgar, and I am 69 years old. I served my country in the Marines before coming back home to build a logistics empire from a single diesel truck. I worked brutal hours, sold the company for a massive profit, placed the funds in a blind trust, and prepared to enjoy a peaceful retirement. I drove my old Ford truck up the winding dirt road of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Georgia. I bought this remote cabin for my wife Valerie as a 40th anniversary gift. She told me she needed a quiet weekend with her girlfriends to unwind and connect with nature. I believed her without a second thought. I had a custom-engraved diamond necklace sitting on the passenger seat wrapped in velvet, meant to be a romantic surprise. The trees parted as I approached the property line, and the crisp mountain air filled my lungs. I wanted to show the woman I loved that after 4 decades, she was still the center of my universe. I turned off the engine early and let the truck coast to a silent stop to avoid ruining the surprise. I stepped out of the vehicle and grabbed the small box. My knees ached slightly from the long drive, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in years. I walked up the trail expecting a warm embrace and the chaotic laughter of her longtime friends. I parked my truck entirely out of sight behind a thicket of towering pines. I expected to hear the chatter of older women and see a row of practical SUVs parked near the wooden porch. The driveway held only one vehicle. It was a silver German sports car. I recognized the license plate and the custom rims immediately. It belonged to Blake, my 36-year-old white son-in-law. Blake was a slick investment consultant who had charmed his way into marrying my daughter, Sydney. He wore tailored suits and drove aggressively fast cars to project an image of endless wealth and success. His presence at my wife's secluded fishing retreat made absolutely no sense. I stopped walking. The heavy silence of the surrounding woods felt deeply unnatural. The birds had stopped singing. A deep primal instinct from my military days warned me that my reality was about to shatter into jagged pieces. I scanned the perimeter of the cabin. The fishing gear Valerie supposedly packed was nowhere in sight. The pristine lake remained untouched. The front door was firmly shut and the blinds were drawn on the main floor. The anomaly of that silver car sitting in the driveway triggered a cold knot of dread in my stomach. I tightened my grip on the velvet box. My mind raced through logical explanations. Perhaps Sydney was inside. Perhaps Blake had driven up to drop off supplies. But the profound quiet of the property told a different story. I left the main path and moved into the tree line to approach the house from the blind side. I needed to assess the situation before making my presence known. I stepped over dry branches with the practiced silence of a veteran. Every step closer to the cabin amplified the dreadful certainty that I was walking straight into an ambush. I approached the back of the cabin with calculated silent steps. The heavy front door was locked tight. I moved toward the side of the house, stepping carefully over the dry pine needles to avoid snapping any twigs. A half-open window on the ground floor caught my attention. The quiet rustle of the wind through the trees was suddenly shattered by unmistakable sounds of physical intimacy. I moved closer to the glass and peered inside the master bedroom. The midday sun illuminated the space perfectly and left absolutely no room for misunderstanding. I saw my wife of 40 years entangled with the man who had sworn to honor and protect my daughter. They were moving together on the heavy oak bed I had built with my own hands. Valerie had her eyes closed, and her face was flushed with a passionate intensity she had not shown me in over a decade. Blake held her tightly and whispered things I could not hear over the violent pounding of my own heart. The shock paralyzed my muscles. I had given this woman everything. I built a fortune to ensure she never had to struggle for a single day. She was repaying my devotion by defiling our sanctuary with our daughter's husband. The scene burned itself into my retina and seared away 40 years of trust and shared history. I did not scream. I did not break the glass or alert them to my presence. I observed them with the cold, absolute detachment of a soldier watching enemy combatants across a battlefield. Every cherished memory of our marriage turned into ashes right in front of my eyes. The woman I loved was dead. She was replaced by a stranger twisting in the sheets with a parasitic fraud. I watched them mock my life, my home, and my daughter's future. The velvet box in my hand felt like a mocking joke. I opened my fingers and let the expensive diamond necklace drop silently into the dirt. It landed among the dead leaves and was entirely forgotten. I pressed my back against the log siding of the cabin and breathed slowly through my nose to control the rage boiling in my veins. The man who arrived at this mountain seeking romance was gone forever. A new dangerous clarity took his place. The urge to resort to physical violence surged forcefully through my body. I reached for the heavy iron door handle on the back patio to confront them and end the deception permanently. My hand hovered mere inches from the cold metal when a sudden sentence from Blake froze me in place. The bedroom went quiet as they finally caught their breath. Blake shifted his weight on the mattress and looked down at my wife. He asked her directly if she had successfully stolen the master key to the hidden wall safe in my home office. Valerie laughed. It was a cruel and familiar sound that echoed through the open window. She confirmed she had the key tucked safely inside her purse. The physical betrayal was suddenly reduced to a minor offense. The real threat was a calculated financial execution. They were not just having a secret affair. They were plotting to dismantle my entire empire and steal the wealth I had secured for my family. I pulled my hand away from the door handle. I stepped backward into the shadows of the forest. The time for a loud, messy confrontation had passed. The cold metal of the heavy iron door handle bit into my palm, but I released my grip immediately. The sudden physical betrayal I just witnessed evaporated from my mind in a fraction of a second. A much deeper and far more lethal threat took its place. The shock of my wife thrashing in the arms of my son-in-law faded into absolute irrelevance compared to the financial execution they were actively discussing. I pressed my spine against the rough cedar siding of the cabin. The wood felt damp and cold against my jacket. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I bypassed the lock screen and opened the voice memo application. My thumb tapped the red record button. The screen illuminated the dark space between the cabin wall and the thick pines. I held the device close to the narrow gap in the window frame. The sensitive microphone captured every jagged breath and every whispered word escaping from the bedroom. My military training instantly overrode 40 years of matrimonial devotion. I ceased being a heartbroken husband. I became an active combatant gathering vital intelligence behind enemy lines. The mountain wind picked up, but I held my hand perfectly still. I needed crystal clear audio to secure my survival. My entire logistics empire had been built on recognizing hidden patterns and securing undeniable leverage. I stood there and listened to the two people I trusted most dismantle my life with casual arrogance. The digital counter on my screen ticked upward second by second. Every recorded syllable became a permanent nail in their respective coffins. I controlled my breathing to maintain absolute silence and focused entirely on the data collection. Valerie's voice drifted through the screen mesh clearly. It was no longer the sweet tone she used to ask for favors at the breakfast table. It was laced with bitter, deep-seated resentment. She complained loudly about my stubborn refusal to upgrade our lifestyle. She reminded Blake that I had sold my shipping company for an obscene 9-figure sum just last year. She expressed pure disgust that I forced us to live on a strict monthly allowance, while the vast bulk of the wealth sat untouched in a corporate blind trust. Then came the ultimate confession. Blake asked her again about the safe in my office. Valerie proudly admitted she had slipped the master key out of my coat pocket while I slept last week. She laughed a sharp, mocking laugh while describing how incredibly easy it was to steal from an old man who trusted her implicitly. Blake's response was clinical and utterly terrifying. He outlined a meticulously crafted scheme to financially gut my legacy. He planned to use the stolen trust documents to forge a bulletproof power of attorney. With Valerie's willing cooperation and her forged signatures, he would successfully bypass the primary security protocols at my bank. He detailed his exact intention to liquidate the main holding accounts and wire the unnameable sum directly into an untraceable offshore account under his exclusive control. But the betrayal did not end with my ruin. Blake chuckled darkly as he explained the final phase of his operation. Once the money cleared international waters, he was going to serve Sydney with divorce papers. He called my beloved daughter a naive stepping stone. He planned to leave her completely bankrupt and entirely humiliated before the entire city of Atlanta. I stood in the shadows and absorbed the full, devastating magnitude of their greed. They were not just stealing my fortune. They intended to legally annihilate my bloodline and leave us with absolutely nothing. The recording captured Blake promising Valerie a life of endless luxury in Europe once the funds transferred successfully. Valerie murmured her eager agreement and pulled him closer. They were sealing our mutual destruction with a kiss. I pressed the red button and immediately saved the audio file to a secure cloud server. I slipped the phone back into my inner jacket pocket and zipped it shut. There would be no screaming today. There would be no dramatic confrontation or throwing of fists. Emotional outbursts were the luxury of fools who lacked a strategic advantage. My Marine discipline anchored my mind in absolute reality. I turned away from the window and left them to their pathetic delusions of victory. I walked back through the dense forest with deliberate and measured steps. I placed my boots carefully on the soft moss to ensure I did not snap a single dry twig. I reached the edge of the property line where my old Ford truck sat hidden in the brush. I looked down at my right hand. I was still gripping the custom velvet box tightly. The diamond necklace inside was meant to celebrate a 40-year lie. I popped the hinge open and pulled the glittering jewelry from its setting. I walked over to a young pine tree bordering the main driveway. I draped the expensive diamond chain over a sharp branch perfectly at eye level. It would serve as a silent psychological marker. When Valerie eventually left the cabin, she would see it catching the sunlight. She would know I had been there. I climbed into the cab of my truck and closed the door without making a sound. I put the vehicle in neutral and let it roll silently down the dirt incline before finally turning the ignition. I pushed the accelerator to the floor the second I hit the paved highway. The heavy truck roared down the winding mountain roads. I drove for 3 hours straight with the radio off and my jaw clenched tight. I pulled into the sweeping driveway of my Atlanta mansion exactly at midnight. The massive house was entirely dark and completely silent. I bypassed the main living areas and marched straight down the hallway into my private study. I locked the heavy oak doors behind me with a solid click. I walked over to the far wall and gripped the edges of a large oil painting. I ripped the canvas down and threw it onto the hardwood floor. The cold steel of my hidden wall safe stared back at me. I leaned in close to inspect the mechanical dial. Deep, fresh scratches marred the metal casing around the keyhole. Someone had forced a secondary tool inside to keep the latch open during their theft. I reached into my desk drawer to check the hidden compartment where I kept my emergency master key. The false bottom was completely empty. The key was gone. The invasion was undeniably real, and the countdown to my financial ruin had officially started. The absence of the master key transformed my private study from a quiet sanctuary into a compromised bunker. The mechanical scratch marks on the safe dial confirmed everything my phone had recorded outside the mountain cabin. Valerie and Blake did not merely possess the key. They had unfettered access to the master copies of my blind trust documents. They possessed my exact signature and all my private routing numbers. Decades spent building a massive logistics empire from a single rusty diesel truck had taught me one undeniable truth about survival in hostile environments. When an enemy breaches your perimeter, you do not panic. You lock down the blast doors. I looked at the tall grandfather clock standing in the corner of the room. It read 1:40 in the morning. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket and dialed a number I reserved strictly for severe corporate emergencies. Fletcher answered on the second ring. His voice carried the sharp, awakened clarity of a man who billed thousands of dollars an hour specifically to handle financial disasters. I did not offer pleasantries or waste time explaining my emotional state. I told him my inner circle had been breached and a hostile takeover of my estate was currently in motion. I instructed him to leave his house immediately and bring his secure laptop to my mansion by 2 o'clock. Fletcher did not ask redundant questions. He understood the lethal gravity of my tone. He simply stated his estimated time of arrival and ended the call. I paced the length of my study, visualizing the impending battle. I had commanded battalions and outmaneuvered cutthroat corporate rivals. Two arrogant amateurs playing with stolen keys had severely underestimated the man they were attempting to destroy. I poured a glass of cold water and waited in the darkness for my attorney to arrive. Fletcher walked through my front door precisely at 2 o'clock in the morning. He carried a heavy, reinforced leather briefcase and wore a dark suit, looking entirely unfazed by the hour. We moved straight into the study. I locked the heavy oak doors and placed my smartphone on the center of my mahogany desk. I instructed Fletcher to listen closely. I pressed play on the audio file I had captured outside the mountain cabin. The room filled with the unmistakable sound of Valerie and Blake mocking my life, detailing their precise strategy to forge a power of attorney and drain the holding accounts of my blind trust. Fletcher sat completely still. His expression hardened into a mask of pure professional fury. He had structured those trust accounts himself 10 years ago with strict provisions to ensure Sydney would always remain financially secure. Hearing a parasitic son-in-law explicitly detail a plan to bankrupt my daughter and funnel her inheritance into offshore accounts ignited a cold wrath in my attorney. The recording ended. Fletcher opened his briefcase and booted up his encrypted terminal. We wasted no time on emotional reactions or shock. We executed a surgical defense. I ordered him to initiate the Fortress Protocol across all my financial holdings immediately. This was a severe failsafe I developed during the aggressive expansion of my logistics company to prevent corporate espionage and embezzlement. Within minutes, Fletcher's rapid keystrokes severed all external access to the blind trust. He established a titanium-grade digital barrier. From this exact second forward, absolutely no assets could be liquidated or moved without my physical presence at the central bank vault. I registered a new biometric retinal scan into the system right there in the study using his secure portable scanner. We added a mandatory dual authorization contingency. Any future transaction would trigger an automatic verification sequence requiring a randomized alphanumeric code generated exclusively by Fletcher's private server. Blake and Valerie thought they had discovered a backdoor into my wealth. Instead, they were about to walk straight into a financial vault wired with digital explosives. The defensive perimeter was flawlessly established. Securing the funds was only the first half of my strategy. A purely defensive posture wins no wars. I needed to trap the enemy and force them into a catastrophic legal mistake. I unlocked the wall safe using my personal combination code and pulled out the original master trust documents. I handed them to Fletcher for secure storage in his firm's private underground vault downtown. In their place, Fletcher generated a flawless set of decoy documents from his mobile printer. He printed them on the exact same thick linen paper bearing the official bank letterheads and watermarks. To the untrained eye of a desperate gambler like Blake, they looked like the absolute keys to the kingdom. They contained identical account numbers and perfectly replicated routing data. However, Fletcher embedded a lethal poison pill deep within the fine print. He integrated a specialized tracking clause specifically designed to flag fraudulent activity. The moment Blake or Valerie attempted to submit these counterfeit documents to any financial institution, the banking system would automatically freeze the transaction entirely. More importantly, the system was hardwired to instantly alert federal authorities of a severe wire fraud attempt. The decoy documents were essentially a self-detonating legal trap designed to catch them red-handed in a federal crime. I placed the counterfeit stack back into the safe and carefully closed the heavy steel door. I left the dial slightly off-center to mimic the exact way I usually kept it. Valerie would return from her sordid weekend entirely convinced she held my financial destruction in the palm of her hand. She had no idea she was holding a direct ticket to a federal indictment. Dawn broke over the sprawling Atlanta skyline, casting long, harsh shadows across the polished hardwood floors of my home. Fletcher packed his equipment and slipped out the back exit moments before the distinct sound of tires crunched on the gravel driveway. The heavy mahogany front door swung open. Valerie walked into the grand foyer, dropping her designer duffel bag onto the expensive Persian rug. The unmistakable smell of stale lake water mingled sickeningly with the lingering scent of Blake's expensive cologne clinging to her jacket. She walked straight into the kitchen wearing a bright, utterly deceitful smile. She held up a small cooler bag and proudly handed me a freshly caught trout, claiming she spent the entire weekend out on the boat, bonding with her girlfriends. I took the cold fish from her hands. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman who was actively plotting to bankrupt our daughter and steal my life's work. I did not flinch. I smiled back warmly and thanked her for the thoughtful gift perfectly hiding my lethal intentions. The silent adjustment had officially begun inside my own house. The evening arrived with the stifling humidity typical of an Atlanta summer. I prepared dinner with the same meticulous precision I applied to every aspect of my life. I seared the trout Valerie brought home, plating it alongside roasted asparagus and a crisp white wine. We sat at the long mahogany dining table. The heavy crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over her face. She looked entirely at ease. There was no trace of guilt in her posture, no nervous tremor in her hands. She sipped her wine and described the fabricated details of her fishing trip. She spoke of the serene morning mist and the laughter of her non-existent girlfriends. I listened attentively and nodded at all the appropriate moments. I played the role of the devoted, oblivious husband flawlessly. My military training made it easy to compartmentalize my disgust and focus entirely on the mission objective. When a pause settled between us, I steered the conversation exactly where I needed it to go. I wiped my mouth with the linen napkin and casually mentioned a phone call I received that afternoon. I told her it was my commercial real estate broker. I kept my tone mild, stripping any excitement from my voice. I informed her that an aggressive commercial developer had zeroed in on a massive dilapidated warehouse I owned on the industrial east side of the city. I had purchased the property decades ago to store my first fleet of delivery trucks, and it had sat empty since I sold the logistics empire. I watched her face carefully as I laid the groundwork for my trap. I needed her to believe that this was just another mundane piece of business, a casual update from a husband sharing his day. Valerie took another sip of her wine, pretending to be only mildly interested. She asked what the developer wanted with an abandoned truck depot. I set my fork down and delivered the precise numbers. I told her the developers desperately needed the land for a massive new distribution hub, and they were willing to bypass all standard corporate protocols to secure the zoning rights immediately. They offered $3 million in pure, unencumbered cash. I let the figure hang in the air. Valerie's hand froze midair. Her eyes widened fractionally. I maintained my absolute composure. I had spent months investigating Blake before this betrayal ever surfaced. I knew his boutique investment firm was a complete sham. It was nothing more than a polished facade hiding a hollow core. Blake had leveraged his business into oblivion to fund a severe gambling addiction. He currently owed $500,000 to a violent loan shark syndicate operating out of the city's underbelly. Those men did not send strongly worded letters. They broke bones and burned down houses to collect their debts. Blake was drowning in a highly lethal financial crisis, and Valerie was foolishly tied to his sinking ship. I leaned forward and added the critical piece of bait. I explained that because the buyers were expediting the purchase, the entire $3 million would be temporarily deposited into an unprotected escrow holding account by next Tuesday. The funds would sit there completely liquid and entirely accessible for 48 hours before Fletcher could formally transfer them into the blind trust. I stressed how highly unusual and slightly vulnerable this transaction was. I complained about the administrative headache it presented. I framed the situation as a massive sum of cash, temporarily floating in the banking system without the fortress-level security protocols that protected the rest of my wealth. I painted a picture of absolute financial vulnerability. The trap was set perfectly. I resumed eating my dinner in complete silence, giving the toxic seed of greed ample time to take root in her mind. The transformation in Valerie was immediate and visceral. The subtle tightening of her jaw and the sudden frantic energy in her eyes betrayed her uncontrollable greed. She tried to mask her excitement by asking mundane questions about the tax implications, but her breathing had grown shallow and fast. She was no longer sitting in our dining room. Her mind was already sprinting toward that unprotected holding account. I finished my meal, collected our empty plates, and walked into the kitchen. I turned on the faucet and let the hot water run over the porcelain. I stood with my back to the dining area, creating the perfect illusion of distraction. Through the dark reflective glass of the kitchen window, I had a clear line of sight to the living room and the outdoor patio. I watched Valerie stand up abruptly. She abandoned her half-finished wine and pulled her smartphone from her pocket with trembling fingers. She practically sprinted toward the sliding glass doors, opening them just wide enough to slip outside into the humid night air. She paced the length of the stone patio, holding the phone tightly against her ear. Her free hand gestured wildly in the darkness. She was frantically dialing Blake. The fake power of attorney they planned to use was suddenly obsolete in her mind. Stealing the master trust required overcoming intense scrutiny and bypassing countless banking hurdles. Intercepting a temporary escrow account bursting with $3 million in liquid cash was the ultimate prize. I scrubbed the plates methodically. The water washed away the remnants of our dinner while I watched my wife conspire against me in the reflection of the glass. I let her spin her web of lies, knowing she was wrapping the noose tightly around her own neck. I dried my hands on a kitchen towel and reached into my pocket for my secondary smartphone. Fletcher had provided me with a highly encrypted device linked directly to a cloning software program we had installed on the home network. Every digital communication entering or leaving Valerie's phone was mirrored directly to my screen. I unlocked the device and opened the intercepted message log. A new text from Valerie to Blake materialized instantly. The words confirmed everything I had orchestrated. She commanded Blake to absolutely halt the current forgery operation. She typed furiously, explaining that attempting to breach the main blind trust was too risky when a far superior target had just presented itself. She detailed the $3 million cash transfer scheduled for next Tuesday. She insisted they pivot their entire strategy to hijack the holding account before the funds could be secured by my attorney. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. They had swallowed the bait whole. The enemy had willingly abandoned their original strategy to chase a mirage I had painted for them. They were running blind straight into a financial slaughterhouse. The harsh morning sunlight reflected off the steel and glass facade of Sydney's downtown architectural firm. I parked my old truck across the busy street and walked into the sleek, modern lobby she had designed entirely by herself. Sydney was a brilliant architect, a woman who understood structural integrity better than anyone in the city, yet she was completely blind to the rot decaying the foundation of her own marriage. I found her sitting behind a massive drafting table buried under complex blueprints and empty coffee cups. She looked up when I entered, and my chest tightened painfully at the sight of her. Sydney was severely exhausted. She had applied heavy layers of expensive foundation to conceal the deep purplish shadows of stress bruising the skin under her eyes. The psychological toll of living with a parasitic fraud was breaking my daughter down physically. Her shoulders were slumped and her usually bright eyes were bloodshot and vacant. I pulled up a heavy leather chair and sat across from her, maintaining my calm and composed demeanor. I asked her how the business was doing, keeping my voice gentle and steady. I needed to assess her mental state before making any tactical moves. Sydney offered a fragile, unconvincing smile and claimed everything was perfectly fine. Her hands, however, trembled uncontrollably as she rearranged the metal pens on her desk. The signs of deep psychological fatigue were absolutely undeniable. Blake was draining her vital energy just as he intended to drain my bank accounts. I reached out and covered her shaking hand with mine. I told her I was simply checking in, offering a moment of paternal comfort in the middle of her chaotic day. The warmth of my gesture broke through her carefully constructed professional facade. Sydney pulled her hand back and let out a long, ragged breath. The professional armor cracked entirely, and she finally confessed, the crushing weight pressing down on her shoulders. She told me she was preparing to leave the office in an hour to co-sign a massive, high-interest commercial loan. Blake had convinced her that his boutique investment firm was on the verge of a highly lucrative international expansion, but he needed a massive temporary influx of capital to secure the necessary overseas licensing. He claimed his current liquid assets were tied up in European escrow, forcing him to seek domestic bridge financing. Because his assets were supposedly frozen, he needed Sydney to pledge her entire architectural firm as the primary collateral to secure the loan. The sheer audacity of his manipulation made my blood run ice cold. He was deeply in debt to violent loan sharks and was now actively weaponizing my daughter's hard-earned business to save his own miserable life. The digital recording of his vile conversation with Valerie burned like a hot coal in my jacket pocket. Every paternal instinct screamed at me to pull out my smartphone, play the crystal-clear audio, and shatter his fabricated reality instantly. I wanted to expose her mother's treason right then and there. But marine discipline held my hand completely still. Warfare requires precise timing, and showing her the recording right now would be a catastrophic tactical error. The psychological shock of discovering her husband and her mother were engaging in a highly illicit affair while plotting to bankrupt her would absolutely break her mind. She would likely dismiss the audio as an elaborate digital fake or suffer a complete nervous breakdown. I needed her alert, rational, and fully capable of protecting her legal interests. If she reacted emotionally and tipped Blake off, he would panic, liquidate whatever funds he could access, and vanish into the wind. I had to dismantle his trap using pure cold logic rather than emotional devastation. I leaned back in my chair and looked at her with stern, calculated authority. I told her that co-signing a high-risk corporate loan required a rigorous secondary review, and as her father and a veteran businessman, I was not going to let her walk into a financial institution blindly. I extended my hand across the desk and demanded to see the preliminary contract. Sydney hesitated for a fraction of a second before pulling a thick manila folder from her leather briefcase. I opened the document and scanned the dense legal jargon with the practiced eye of a man who had negotiated ruthless corporate mergers for 3 decades. Blake had not just found a standard commercial lender. He had engaged a predatory shadow institution that specialized in aggressive asset seizure. I pulled a red pen from her desk cup and began slashing through the pages with sharp, decisive strokes. I pointed directly to 3 deeply buried clauses that Sydney had completely missed. First, the loan featured an escalating compounded interest rate that would legally bankrupt her firm within 6 months of a single missed payment. Second, the contract held an ironclad cross-collateralization mandate, meaning the lenders could seize her personal residential property alongside her business assets immediately upon default. Finally, and most lethally, I highlighted a specific liability waiver buried on the last page. This clause legally bound Sydney as the primary guarantor of the funds, explicitly stating she verified the legitimacy of Blake's phantom investment firm. I looked my daughter strictly in the eyes and explained the brutal reality. By signing this document, she was not just risking simple bankruptcy. She was officially tying her name to federal wire fraud if Blake's company failed to produce verifiable tax returns. Sydney stared at the red ink bleeding through the heavy paper. The color completely drained from her exhausted face. The romantic illusion of supporting her ambitious husband evaporated, replaced by the terrifying realization of absolute legal ruin. She pushed the contract away from her as if it were coated in poison. Sydney immediately picked up her office phone and dialed Blake's private number. Her voice shook slightly as she informed him she needed more time to review the extreme legal liabilities and would not be signing the documents today. Even from across the wide desk, I could hear Blake completely lose his mind. His voice erupted through the receiver in a violent, unhinged scream, aggressively demanding she get to the bank immediately and stop acting like a coward. Sydney quietly hung up the phone, her hands trembling harder than before. She finally recognized the pure desperation of a cornered animal in her husband's voice. I left her office and immediately contacted an elite private security firm run by former military contractors I trusted implicitly. I authorized a blank check to secure my daughter's physical safety. That night, the suburban quiet of Sydney's upscale neighborhood was disrupted by the sudden arrival of 2 unmarked black SUVs. The heavily armored vehicles parked silently at the end of her driveway, their tinted windows blending seamlessly into the dark shadows of the ancient oak trees. The highly trained operatives inside watched the property with thermal optics. The loan sharks Blake owed $500,000 to were officially out of patience and were now actively circling his perimeter. The deadly countdown had reached 0. Blake ran completely out of runway by Tuesday morning. The unmarked security vehicles parked outside Sydney's house had successfully spooked him, but the final blow came in the form of a physical visit to his downtown office. 2 enforcers from the loan shark syndicate bypassed his receptionist and delivered a brutal 48-hour ultimatum. He needed to produce $500,000 in pure cash, or he would pay with his life. The sheer terror of imminent physical destruction stripped away his polished corporate facade entirely. I listened to his unraveling through the cloning software on Valerie's phone. He called her from a burner device in a state of absolute rabid panic. The illusion of their sophisticated $3 million warehouse heist vanished instantly. Blake could no longer afford the luxury of waiting for my fabricated escrow account to clear. Survival dictated immediate action. He screamed into the receiver, completely abandoning his usual manipulative charm. He ordered Valerie to revert to their original timeline and execute the forgery at the bank today. He demanded she use the master trust documents she had stolen from my wall safe to forge a comprehensive power of attorney. He threatened to expose their affair to the entire city if she hesitated for even a fraction of a second. Valerie tried to argue, claiming the pivot back to the trust was too sudden and highly suspicious. Blake silenced her with a vicious verbal assault, reducing her from a willing co-conspirator to a terrified pawn. He instructed her to walk into the main branch of my bank, present the counterfeit authorizations, and wire the $500,000 directly to his offshore shell company before noon. He hung up the phone and left her with no other choice. I anticipated her movements the moment the call ended. I left my mansion in a hired black sedan with heavily tinted windows driven by one of the former military contractors currently securing Sydney's property. We parked directly across the busy street from the towering glass and steel structure of my primary financial institution in downtown Atlanta. 15 minutes later, Valerie finally arrived. She drove her luxury SUV erratically and parked illegally in a commercial loading zone entirely indifferent to the municipal traffic laws. I watched her step out onto the sunlit pavement. She wore a perfectly tailored designer suit, oversized dark sunglasses, and a rigid posture radiating artificial confidence. She carried a slim leather briefcase holding the decoy documents Fletcher and I had carefully planted in my wall safe. She truly believed she was walking into that building as a conquering queen, preparing to claim her rightful throne. She had absolutely no idea she was stepping onto the trigger plate of a highly calibrated federal snare. I reached into my jacket, pulled out my encrypted phone, and dialed a direct unlisted number. The bank manager answered immediately. He was a ruthless and exceedingly loyal financial operative who had personally managed my corporate wealth for over 2 decades. He understood the absolute gravity of the Fortress Protocol. I instructed him to keep the line open and closely observe the woman approaching the front security doors. I described Valerie's attire in exact detail and confirmed she was carrying actively fraudulent authorization papers. I sat back in the cool air-conditioned leather seat of the sedan and watched my wife push through the heavy revolving glass doors. The open phone line hissed softly with the ambient noise of the bank lobby. I heard the manager instruct his head teller to accept whatever documents the incoming client presented and process them directly through the primary verification scanner without asking any preliminary questions. I rested my hand on my knee and stared at the massive architectural facade of the bank. The physical betrayal at the mountain cabin had initially shattered my heart, but watching her willingly attempt to finalize my absolute ruin solidified my resolve into pure iron. I felt absolutely no pity as she walked toward the teller counter. She was executing her own financial death warrant with a perfectly practiced smile. The audio feed from the bank manager's phone provided a crystal-clear broadcast of the entire execution. Valerie approached the polished marble counter and greeted the teller with sickeningly sweet condescension. She slid the forged power of attorney across the desk, loudly demanding an immediate wire transfer of $500,000 to Blake's designated offshore holding company. She cited my supposedly declining health as the urgent reason for her newly acquired legal authority. The teller followed the manager's exact instructions. She took the heavy linen paper, offered a polite nod, and fed the documents directly into the high-speed verification scanner. The digital trap snapped shut instantly. The tracking claws embedded deep within Fletcher's decoy documents communicated with the bank's central mainframe. The system immediately recognized the fraudulent biometric markers and the unauthorized routing codes. A silent alarm triggered across the entire executive floor, automatically freezing every single asset tied to my name and simultaneously dispatching an emergency alert to the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The ambient noise of the lobby went dead quiet on my phone line. The bank manager stepped out of his glass office and approached the counter. His footsteps echoed sharply on the marble floor. He did not offer Valerie a seat or a glass of water. He stood tall, looked down at her, and coldly informed her that the documents she had just presented were counterfeit. He stated with absolute unwavering authority that the power of attorney was entirely fraudulent. All trust accounts were permanently frozen, and bank security had already locked the exterior doors. I watched through the tinted window of the sedan as Valerie's flawless posture collapsed completely. Valerie staggered backward from the teller counter as if she had been physically struck. Pure, unadulterated terror erased her arrogant facade. She abandoned the leather briefcase on the marble counter, spun around, and sprinted blindly toward the exit. She shoved past an elderly customer and burst through the revolving glass doors, gasping for air like a drowning woman. I watched her practically fall into her illegally parked SUV. She slammed the door shut and frantically locked it. Through my cloned digital connection, I listened as she immediately dialed Blake. Her voice was a hysterical, high-pitched shriek. She screamed that the bank manager knew everything, the documents were fake and the accounts were completely inaccessible. She sobbed uncontrollably, realizing the federal authorities would be hunting her within the hour. Blake did not offer comfort or attempt to formulate a new financial strategy. The loss of the money pushed his survival instinct into a dark, murderous territory. His voice dropped to a lethal, menacing whisper that chilled the blood in my veins. He told her to shut up and go hide. He declared he was driving to my mansion tonight to handle the old man permanently. The heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the silent mansion precisely at 9 o'clock that evening. I watched the security feed on my tablet and saw Blake standing on the granite porch. He was holding a bottle of reserve bourbon and wearing a perfectly tailored suit that belied the desperate, cornered animal thrashing inside him. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Blake immediately plastered a look of deep, artificial concern across his face. He extended the expensive bottle of liquor as a peace offering and stepped into the grand foyer uninvited. He claimed he was just in the neighborhood and wanted to check on his favorite father-in-law. His eyes, however, betrayed his true intentions. They darted rapidly around the entryway, scanning the antique vases, the original artwork, and the heavy oak doors leading to my private study. He was practically vibrating with lethal adrenaline, searching for an opening, a weakness, or a physical asset to leverage. He followed me into the living room and launched into a carefully rehearsed monologue about family and stress. He asked probing questions about my daily routine, my sleep schedule, and my recent doctor visits. He was subtly trying to ascertain my mental acuity and physical vulnerability. He needed to know if the man standing before him was a sharp adversary or an expiring nuisance ready to be pushed over the edge. I poured 2 glasses of his bourbon and handed him one. I observed his calculated movements and realized he was physically sizing me up for a permanent removal. He thought he was the predator stalking a wounded stag. He had no idea he had just walked willingly into a reinforced steel cage. I did not give him the opportunity to escalate his hostile reconnaissance. I decided to completely preempt his murderous intentions by feeding him a narrative he desperately wanted to believe. I took a slow sip of the bourbon and let out a long, ragged sigh. I purposely slumped my shoulders and rubbed my chest with my free hand, mimicking the exact symptoms of severe cardiovascular fatigue. I allowed my hand to tremble slightly as I set the crystal glass down on the mahogany side table. Blake leaned forward instantly, his predatory instincts triggered by the display of physical weakness. I looked him in the eyes and delivered a flawless performance of a broken, exhausted old man. I confessed that managing my remaining real estate portfolio was becoming an unbearable physical burden. I explicitly brought up the commercial warehouse on the east side of the city. I told him the pending $3 million cash sale was generating a massive amount of corporate red tape and the stress was actively destroying my failing heart. I rubbed my chest again and closed my eyes in feigned agony. Blake remained completely silent, hanging on to every single syllable. He was recalculating his entire strategy in real time. Murder was a messy, high-risk endeavor with a massive potential for federal prison. A voluntary financial handover was infinitely cleaner. I opened my eyes and looked at him with desperate paternal pleading. I told him the buyers were demanding a mountain of complex compliance documents by next week, and I simply lacked the stamina to handle the corporate lawyers. I framed the offer not as a business proposition, but as a desperate plea for a son to rescue his failing father. I offered him the official position of lead commercial broker on the warehouse deal. I explained that I needed his firm to handle the escrow transfers, manage the aggressive buyer communications, and legally close the cash sale on behalf of my estate. To seal the trap, I offered him a 20% commission on the final $3 million payout. $600,000 in pure legitimate profit just for finalizing the paperwork. I watched the murderous tension drain completely from his posture. The prospect of legally touching a $3 million holding account short-circuited his rational brain. The sheer magnitude of the proposition completely blinded his logical faculties. Blake did not pause to question why a seasoned logistics magnate would suddenly hand over a massive commercial real estate deal to a boutique investment consultant with zero industrial experience. His suffocating debt and the violent threats from the loan sharks had eradicated his ability to perform basic due diligence. The greed radiating from his body was almost palpable in the quiet living room. He set his bourbon down and accepted the position immediately, his voice thick with poorly concealed triumph. He launched into an arrogant speech about his vast corporate network and his unparalleled ability to streamline complex cash transactions. In his mind, he had just won the ultimate victory. He believed he was going to gain full, unfettered legal access to the $3 million holding account without having to resort to risky forgery or physical violence. Once he controlled the escrow transfers, he fully intended to siphon the entire sum offshore and disappear. He thanked me profusely, calling me a visionary for trusting his expertise. I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and retrieved a neatly folded document. I told him I had already instructed my attorneys to draft a preliminary brokerage agreement to expedite the process. I handed the crisp white paper across the coffee table. Blake snatched the contract with the eager desperation of a starving man being handed a feast. I watched him smooth the paper over his knee, his eyes scanning the bold headers detailing his massive commission and his total authority over the impending cash transfer. He was so intoxicated by the illusion of supreme control that he failed to recognize he was stepping onto a highly calibrated landmine. Blake confidently flipped to the second page of the agreement to formalize his signature. His gold pen hovered over the dotted line, but his hand suddenly stopped moving. His eyes locked onto a dense paragraph buried deep within the standard compliance clauses. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. He read the fine print twice to ensure he was not hallucinating. To legally act as the primary broker and take control of the $3 million escrow account, Blake's investment firm was strictly required to deposit a $500,000 surety bond into a neutral holding trust by this coming Friday. The clause was non-negotiable and federally mandated to prevent broker fraud. Blake sat frozen on the sofa. He was utterly, completely bankrupt. His personal accounts were drained and his credit lines were maxed out from his degenerate gambling. He stared at the paper in absolute horror. To steal the $3 million and save his own life, he had to find a way to dig up $500,000 in pure cash in exactly 3 days. The crushing reality of the $500,000 surety bond completely shattered Blake's arrogant facade. The moment he left my property and returned to his leased condominium, his panic mutated into violent, undirected wrath. I listened through the cloned audio feed as he turned his absolute fury onto Valerie. He screamed that she had completely botched the bank forgery and demanded she fix the immediate cash deficit. Blake gave her a brutal ultimatum. He told her she had less than 48 hours to procure $500,000 or the loan sharks would dismember him, and he would take her down with him by exposing every sordid detail of their affair to her high society friends. Valerie was entirely cornered. Her personal credit cards were already declining and her joint accounts were locked tight by the Fortress Protocol. Pure desperation breeds reckless behavior. The next morning, the moment I left for my morning run, Valerie slipped into my private dressing room. She bypassed the regular jewelry boxes and went straight for the custom mahogany display case tucked in the back corner of my closet. She targeted my collection of vintage Rolex watches. These were exceedingly rare timepieces I had meticulously acquired during the early, highly profitable years of my logistics business. Each watch represented a specific milestone in my corporate ascensions. Valerie scooped up 6 of the most valuable chronographs, shoving the heavy gold and platinum pieces into her designer handbag. She completely ignored the immense sentimental value of the items. In her terrified mind, my life's milestones were nothing more than a quick, liquid asset meant to buy the survival of her parasitic lover. She zipped the bag shut and hurried out of the house, entirely unaware that her blatant theft was the exact next step in my precisely calculated operation. I had fully anticipated this exact sequence of events. When you systematically cut off a predator's access to their primary food source, they will inevitably strike at the nearest available target. I had intentionally left the mahogany display case unlocked the night before. I knew that once Blake squeezed her for immediate untraceable cash, Valerie would hunt for easily liquidated physical assets. I let her steal the watches. I stood in the shadow of the grand staircase and watched her practically sprint out the front door, clutching her heavy handbag against her chest. I immediately pulled up the GPS tracking software on my encrypted terminal. I had previously installed a microscopic tracking beacon deep inside the lining of her favorite purse. A blinking red dot moved steadily down the highway, heading straight into the affluent commercial district of downtown Atlanta. Valerie believed she was executing a flawless covert maneuver to secure Blake's survival. She drove her luxury SUV with aggressive urgency, cutting across lanes of traffic to reach her destination. She pulled into the private parking garage of an elite high-end pawn shop known for quietly brokering luxury goods for the city's desperate elite. The establishment sat nestled between an upscale boutique and a private investment firm, projecting an aura of absolute discretion. Valerie straightened her jacket, put on her oversized sunglasses, and walked through the reinforced glass doors with the watches heavy in her bag. She assumed she would negotiate a discreet, lucrative deal with an anonymous broker who cared only about the purity of the gold and the authenticity of the serial numbers. She fundamentally misunderstood the depth of my reach within this city. My logistics empire had operated across every sector of Atlanta, and my network of loyal associates remained entirely intact. I watched the GPS beacon stop precisely inside the pawn shop. I leaned back against the cool plaster of my hallway wall and checked my watch. The trap I had laid inside that specific store was currently snapping shut around her wrist. She was actively attempting to fence my stolen property to a man who would gladly lay down his life for my family. The execution of her dignity was proceeding with absolute military precision. The owner of the upscale pawn shop was a heavily tattooed, fiercely loyal man who had served directly under my command during our brutal deployment in the Marines. We had bled in the same mud, and I had personally financed the launch of his business when we both successfully returned to civilian life. I had called him 30 minutes before Valerie arrived, providing him with a precise tactical directive. When Valerie approached the polished glass counter and emptied the 6 vintage Rolex watches onto the velvet display mat, the owner recognized them instantly. He played his designated part with flawless stone-faced execution. He picked up his jeweler's loupe, examined the pristine timepieces, and flatly dismissed their immense value. Valerie confidently demanded $400,000 for the collection. The owner stared at her coldly and offered her exactly $100,000 in cash. Valerie gasped in absolute outrage, arguing frantically that the watches were worth triple that amount on the open market. The owner simply shrugged, cited a fabricated drop in the vintage luxury market, and told her to take the cash or leave his store immediately. Desperation completely crushed her pride. Valerie accepted the severely lowballed offer. The owner slid banded stacks of $100 bills across the counter. Above them, completely hidden within the ceiling fixtures, a high-definition security camera captured every single frame of the illicit transaction. It recorded Valerie's clear facial features, the exact serial numbers of my stolen property, and her eager acceptance of the dirty money. She was now legally guilty of grand larceny. The owner texted me a single encrypted confirmation code the very second she walked out the door. The undeniable visual evidence of her felony was already safely secure on his private server. Valerie drove directly to a secluded parking lot on the outskirts of the city to meet Blake. She proudly handed him the heavy canvas bag containing the $100,000 in cash, expecting a hero's welcome for saving his life. I listened through the cloned phone feed as Blake unzipped the bag, quickly counted the banded stacks, and immediately erupted into a violent, unhinged rage. The money was drastically insufficient. He needed a $500,000 surety bond to execute the warehouse broker fraud, and he was still $400,000 short. The violent loan sharks were practically breathing down his neck. Completely out of options and running on pure toxic survival instinct, Blake crossed a horrific, unforgivable line. He paced the rough asphalt and told Valerie that their previous strategies were simply too slow. They needed immediate, unassailable collateral to secure the offshore cash. He outlined his final, desperate move. They were going to visit Sydney's house tonight under the guise of a comforting family dinner. Blake explicitly instructed Valerie to acquire a heavy liquid sedative. Once Sydney was rendered completely unconscious, they would physically force her limp hand onto the digital ink pad and stamp her thumbprint directly onto the predatory commercial loan documents. My encrypted phone vibrated against the mahogany desk of my private study, shattering the tense silence of the late evening. The caller ID displayed a scrambled alphanumeric sequence, confirming it was the lead operative from the private security detail I had stationed outside Sydney's suburban residence. I answered immediately, bypassing any formal greeting. The operative's voice was clipped and entirely professional, delivering a rapid situational update. He reported that a dark luxury sedan had just bypassed the neighborhood gate and parked directly in my daughter's driveway. Blake and Valerie had exited the vehicle carrying 2 expensive bottles of heavy red wine and a thick leather portfolio. They had arrived entirely unannounced, executing the desperate physical ambush Blake had planned in the pawnshop parking lot. My blood turned to absolute ice. The federal banking freeze had driven Blake into a corner of pure, unadulterated madness, and he was now weaponizing my own wife to physically assault my daughter. He intended to drug her into submission and steal her business right in her own living room. I ended the call and immediately dialed Fletcher. I ordered my attorney to meet me at Sydney's address in exactly 12 minutes with the corporate umbrella documentation we had finalized that afternoon. I grabbed my keys and sprinted toward the garage, fueled by a terrifying cocktail of paternal rage and absolute military focus. I pushed my vehicle to its absolute mechanical limits, tearing through the quiet residential streets of Atlanta. I had methodically dismantled every financial escape route Blake possessed, but I had severely underestimated his willingness to commit physical violence against his own wife to save his miserable life. I prayed I would arrive before the sedative took effect. Inside the brightly lit living room, the illusion of a comforting family gathering was being violently weaponized. I accessed the internal security cameras I had discreetly upgraded the previous week, watching the live feed on my dashboard monitor as I parked 2 blocks away. Valerie stood in the designer kitchen, playing the role of the deeply concerned mother flawlessly. She uncorked the heavy red wine and poured 3 massive glasses, carefully positioning her body to block Sydney's line of sight. With practiced, terrifying precision, Valerie retrieved a small vial from her designer purse and emptied a concentrated liquid sedative directly into Sydney's crystal goblet. She carried the drinks into the living room, handing the poisoned glass to her daughter with a warm, maternal smile. Sydney took a deep, exhausted drink, completely desperate for a moment of peace after the psychological torment of the past 48 hours. The chemical reaction was horrifyingly fast. Within minutes, Sydney's posture collapsed against the plush fabric of the sofa. Her eyelids fluttered, and a deep, unnatural sluggishness overtook her entire nervous system. She slurred her words, attempting to set her half-empty glass on the table but missing the edge entirely. The glass shattered on the hardwood floor, but Sydney barely registered the noise. Her head rolled back, completely stripped of her motor functions and rational defenses. Blake immediately abandoned his facade of the loving, supportive husband. He lunged forward with predatory speed, sweeping the broken glass aside and slamming the predatory commercial loan contract down onto the glass coffee table. He pulled a small circular digital ink pad from his jacket pocket and placed it beside the documents. Sydney moaned in protest, a weak, disoriented sound of absolute vulnerability. Valerie stood perfectly still, watching with cold indifference as Blake aggressively grabbed Sydney's limp, unresisting right hand. He flattened her palm, isolating her thumb, and forcefully pressed it down into the dark ink. He maneuvered her arm like a lifeless mannequin, aligning her stained finger directly over the primary guarantor's signature line of the massive, high-interest loan. He was seconds away from legally binding her to absolute financial ruin and federal fraud. I did not bother turning the brass handle. I kicked the heavy oak front door with the flat of my boot, shattering the reinforced wooden frame and sending the deadbolt flying across the foyer. I strode into the living room with the explosive force of a detonated grenade, closely followed by Fletcher carrying a thick legal briefcase. Blake jumped backward in sheer terror, dropping Sydney's hand just inches from the binding paper. I crossed the room in 3 massive strides, snatched the predatory contract directly off the glass coffee table, and ripped the thick stack of papers into unrecognizable shreds. I threw the ruined confetti directly into his pale, sweating face. I stepped between Blake and my unconscious daughter, acting as a physical wall of absolute consequence. I looked Blake dead in the eyes and completely dismantled his final, desperate illusion. I informed him that his violent ambush was entirely useless. I explained that immediately after leaving Sydney's office earlier that afternoon, Fletcher and I had executed a rapid corporate restructuring maneuver. We had legally transferred complete ownership of Sydney's architectural firm into a highly impenetrable, protective corporate umbrella controlled exclusively by my primary blind trust. I stared down at him with pure disgust and delivered the lethal financial reality. Sydney no longer owned the collateral he was attempting to steal. Her thumbprint meant absolutely nothing. The commercial property, the business licenses, and the corporate accounts were completely beyond his reach, locked behind a fortress of federal legal protection. His entire violent operation had achieved absolutely zero financial leverage. He was still $500,000 in debt, and his time had officially run out. The absolute finality of his defeat fractured Blake's mind completely. The polished corporate facade burned away in an instant, leaving nothing but a rabid, cornered coward. He let out an unhinged scream of pure fury, grabbed Valerie violently by the arm, and dragged her forcefully out of the house. He threw her roughly against the side of his idling vehicle in the dark driveway, completely losing any remaining sense of spatial awareness or self-preservation. I walked calmly to the open bay window overlooking the front yard, pulled out my encrypted smartphone, and engaged the high-definition recording function. Blake paced the concrete like a trapped animal, screaming at Valerie with vicious volume. His voice echoed through the quiet suburban night, capturing every single damning detail of their treacherous operation. He explicitly raged about their hidden affair, cursed her for botching the $3 million bank transfer, and screamed about his massive debts to the violent loan syndicate. He laid out their entire criminal conspiracy loudly and clearly while Valerie sobbed uncontrollably against the car door. I stood in the dark, recording every single toxic syllable of his confession, finally holding the absolute destruction of their lives in the palm of my hand. Blake's 24-hour window had shrunk to a narrow, suffocating sliver of light. The loan sharks had evolved from vague threats to graphic intimidation. They had sent a crisp, high-resolution photo of his mother's house in the suburbs to his private phone, along with a final violent timestamp for tonight. He threw his expensive watch against the study wall, the sound of shattering glass barely cutting through his frantic, uneven breathing. He no longer cared about the facade of the concerned son-in-law or the calculated manipulator. He stormed into my study, his clothes disheveled and his eyes wild, his hands shaking as he gripped the arm of my chair. He did not offer a drink or a greeting. He bypassed the social pleasantries entirely and demanded $1 million advance on the warehouse deal. He claimed the market was shifting and he needed immediate liquidity to stabilize his firm, but the desperate quiver in his voice betrayed the truth. He was drowning, and he was clawing at the only life preserver he could see, entirely unaware that he was gripping a razor blade that would cut him to the bone. I remained seated watching him with the detached clinical coldness one reserves for an insect caught in a spider's web. I carefully reviewed the tactical notes within Kichban Ong Daden 2_13.docx before answering. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch until his composure began to fray at the edges. I told him that I could not simply hand over cash from a pending warehouse sale as my estate was currently undergoing a rigid mandatory audit. It was the perfect lie calculated to trigger his paranoia while maintaining my status as the helpless wealthy benefactor. I watched his face flush with frantic heat as I opened a side drawer and pulled out a clean, minimalist business card. I slid it across the mahogany desk with surgical precision. I told him it was for Apex Capital, a private high-risk lending institution that specialized in bridging the gap for commercial brokers during stalled real estate transactions. I spoke of them as an old, trusted contact from my early days in the logistics industry, a firm that did not ask questions if the collateral was substantial. I knew that Kichban Ongdaden Mao 1_13.docx laid out exactly how to manipulate his greed, and I was playing the notes perfectly. Blake stared at the card. It was his only path out of the grave he had dug for himself, and he knew it. I promised him that if he secured the bridge loan through them, the warehouse sale would move forward as planned, ensuring he could pay back his debts and pocket his lucrative commission. Blake did not waste a second. He turned on his heel and rushed out of the mansion, leaving the heavy front door swinging open in his wake. He drove like a maniac through the city streets, arriving at the downtown headquarters of Apex Capital with sweat soaking through his shirt. He was ushered into a sterile, windowless office where a stern mess of a telephone book. Blake did not read the dense legal prose. He did not examine the predatory interest rates or the ironclad default penalties. He did not care about the consequences that would inevitably follow once the terms were violated. He was a man starving for air, and this contract was his oxygen. He signed his name with a fountain pen that felt heavy in his trembling hand, legally binding his investment firm, his personal bank accounts, and every potential future earning as absolute collateral against the $500,000 loan. He ignored the reality that he was selling his soul for a temporary reprieve. He was focused entirely on the wiring instructions that would save his mother's house and silence the loan sharks. He felt a surge of intoxicating victory as the manager confirmed the funds would be transferred within the hour. The moment Blake stepped out of the building, clutching the confirmation receipt like a holy relic, the manager of Apex Capital picked up his private desk phone. He dialed a direct line that rang only once before I answered in my study. The manager's voice was devoid of emotion as he delivered the final verdict. "It is done, sir." He signed everything he said, keeping his eyes on the lobby exit where Blake was hailing a taxi. I hung up the phone and looked out at the evening sky, feeling the weight of the game finally settling in my favor. Apex Capital was not a partner. It was a shadow subsidiary entirely owned and operated by my own blind trust. Blake had just legally handed over every scrap of his life to me, and he had done it with a smile on his face, believing he had outsmarted the old man. He had no idea he was now my direct employee, and his debt was now the foundation of his complete and total destruction. Blake transferred the extorted funds with the manic speed of a survivor escaping a burning building. He wired $200,000 directly to the subterranean accounts of the loan shark syndicate, effectively buying back his physical safety. The remaining $300,000 went straight into the designated federal holding trust, satisfying the absolute requirement for the surety bond on the warehouse deal. The moment the digital confirmation illuminated his phone screen, a profound and toxic arrogance replaced his suffocating fear. He possessed the legal clearance to broker the $3 million cash transaction. He felt invincible. He drove back to my mansion that evening, strutting through the heavy oak doors as if he had personally laid the foundation of the estate. He poured himself a glass of my most expensive scotch without asking permission and sprawled across the living room sofa. He looked at me not with the feigned respect of a son-in-law, but with the cold, calculating stare of an undertaker appraising a fresh corpse. Valerie immediately mirrored his newfound dominance. She stood beside him, resting her manicured hand on his shoulder, and shot me a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. The terrified woman who had frantically fenced my vintage watches yesterday no longer existed. In her mind, the $3 million was already sitting securely in their offshore accounts. I was merely a temporary expiring nuisance, a ghost lingering in a house that she believed she was about to inherit. She spoke to me in clipped, dismissive tones, instructing me to stay out of the main corridors while they conducted important business. I maintained my exhausted, fragile facade perfectly. I nodded slowly and retreated toward my study, allowing them to bask in the blinding glow of their false victory. The illusion of absolute wealth completely corrupted Valerie's sense of reality by the following morning. Operating under the absolute certainty that she and Blake were days away from cashing out the massive commercial real estate payout, she initiated a hostile takeover of my personal living space. I sat in my private study, listening through the heavy mahogany doors as a brigade of high-end interior designers and structural contractors invaded the grand foyer. Valerie was marching through the main corridors, her voice echoing with the shrill, demanding tone of a monarch, ordering the execution of peasants. She was not simply planning renovations. She was systematically erasing my entire existence from the property. I heard her commanding a team of laborers to dismantle my custom library and tear down the antique wood paneling I had personally commissioned 30 years ago to celebrate my very first corporate acquisition. She boldly instructed the lead contractor to haul my leather armchairs, my framed maritime maps, and my personal logistical awards out to the industrial dumpster currently sitting in the driveway. She explicitly told the crew to throw away anything that smelled like an old man. Her brazen audacity was entirely fueled by the impending phantom millions. She paraded a lead architect through the dining room, aggressively pointing at load-bearing walls she wanted demolished to create an expansive open-concept entertainment space for her high society associates. She spoke loudly about importing pure Italian marble and commissioning custom European chandeliers, treating the entire mansion as a blank canvas funded by my impending financial ruin. She completely ignored the fundamental legal reality that her name resided on exactly 0 of the property deeds. The intoxicating promise of Blake's impending brokerage commission had convinced her she possessed supreme, untouchable authority over my entire estate. I watched the live security feed on my encrypted tablet as her hired crew aggressively shoved my antique globe into a heavy plastic trash bin. She stood in the center of the devastated room, sipping imported sparkling water, absolutely radiating triumph. She believed she had successfully outsmarted me, outmaneuvered my legal protections, and secured a permanent life of unearned luxury. She was orchestrating my total erasure with a joyful, vicious smile, entirely unaware of the catastrophic trap waiting beneath her feet. I locked my tablet, stood up, and smoothed the lapels of my suit jacket. It was time to permanently halt the destruction of my home and terminate Valerie's delusion. I opened the study doors and walked calmly into the chaotic living room. The heavy thud of my footsteps commanded immediate attention. I bypassed Valerie entirely and approached the lead contractor, who was currently preparing to smash a sledgehammer into the plaster wall. I pulled a thick stack of $100 bills from my pocket and handed it directly to him. I firmly ordered the entire crew to drop their tools, exit the premises immediately, and never return. I informed them their services were permanently canceled. The workers recognized genuine authority instantly. They packed their equipment and vanished through the front door within seconds, leaving Valerie standing alone in the center of the room. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. She launched into a violent, screaming tirade, demanding to know how I dared to interrupt her renovation schedule. She shrieked that the house was outdated, that I was a controlling tyrant, and that she was finally upgrading the property to match her incoming social status. She aggressively marched toward me, her finger pointing sharply at my chest, completely blinded by her own venomous arrogance. I did not raise my voice or react to her hysterical provocations. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and retrieved a crisp, formal white envelope bearing the embossed logo of my primary financial institution. I held it out between us, maintaining absolute icy eye contact. Her screaming halted abruptly. She stared at the sealed paper, a sudden flicker of primal hesitation flashing across her eyes. I pushed the envelope directly into her trembling hand without saying a single word. Valerie tore the thick paper open with frantic, uncoordinated movements. She pulled out the heavy legal notice and scanned the dense corporate text. The arrogant flush of victory vanished from her cheeks, replaced by an ashen, bloodless pallor. The document was an official, notarized notification of total financial severance. I had executed the final phase of the Fortress Protocol. Every single joint banking account linking my name to hers had been permanently dissolved and seized by my blind trust. Her premium platinum credit cards, which she relied upon entirely to fund her extravagant lifestyle, were officially canceled and flagged for immediate confiscation. She gasped a sharp, ragged sound of genuine panic and dropped the paper onto the hardwood floor. Her hands shook violently as she pulled her smartphone from her pocket and furiously opened her primary mobile banking application. The digital screen loaded, displaying her current financial reality in stark, undeniable numbers. Her primary checking account balance read exactly $0. Her savings accounts were completely empty. She frantically refreshed the screen, tapping the glass with manic desperation, but the numbers remained absolutely frozen. The limitless wealth she believed she possessed had been entirely eradicated. She was completely, utterly broke. The heavy mahogany doors of Fletcher's downtown corporate office swung open with a soft click, sealing the room in absolute silence. I sat at the head of the massive glass conference table, my posture rigid, my expression wiped clean of any paternal anxiety. I needed to execute this extraction with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing a malignant tumor. Sydney walked into the room carrying the exhaustion of a woman drowning in a storm she could not understand. She dropped her leather briefcase onto the floor and immediately folded her arms across her chest. She was defensive. She was terrified. She was completely trapped in Blake's fabricated reality. She demanded to know why I had summoned her away from the firm in the middle of the workday. I asked her to sit down, keeping my voice low and completely level. She refused to take the chair. She paced the length of the conference room, her voice rising in pitch as she began to aggressively defend her husband. She defended his phantom international investments. She defended his sudden, desperate need for capital. She defended the very man who had tried to physically assault her just 48 hours prior. It was a visceral display of psychological trauma. Blake had isolated her entirely, warping her perception of reality until she could no longer distinguish a threat from a lifeline. She claimed Blake was simply under immense pressure, and that I was completely overstepping my boundaries by interfering in her marriage. I did not interrupt her frantic pacing. I let her exhaust her rehearsed defenses, knowing that the foundation of her denial was about to be pulverized into dust. I simply waited for her breathing to become shallow before I slid a thick black binder across the smooth glass surface of the table. I opened the heavy black binder and methodically laid out the indisputable architecture of Blake's treason. I did not use emotional language. I used facts. I used numbers. I used the brutal clarity of documented reality. I pushed the first stack of papers toward her trembling hands. These were Blake's authentic personal banking statements, entirely decoupled from his fabricated corporate portfolio. I traced my finger down the columns of red ink, showing her the reality of his massive, uncontrolled gambling addiction. I showed her the reality of hundreds of thousands of dollars evaporating into illegal offshore betting syndicates. I showed her the reality of his absolute, unmitigated financial bankruptcy. Sydney stared at the numbers, her eyes darting back and forth as her brain struggled to process the devastating mathematics. Before she could formulate a defense, I placed a series of high-definition 8x10 photographs directly on top of the bank statements. The images displayed two unmarked black SUVs parked ominously at the end of her own suburban driveway. I pointed to the heavily armed operatives sitting inside the vehicles captured through thermal imaging by my private security detail. I explained with cold, unwavering precision that these men were not private investigators. They were violent enforcers for a ruthless loan shark syndicate. I informed her that Blake owed them $500,000 and they were currently circling her home because her husband had willingly offered her life as collateral. Sydney's knees finally buckled under the crushing weight of the truth. She sank into the nearest leather chair, her breath hitching in her throat. To seal the absolute destruction of his facade, I retrieved a final set of heavily redacted documents. These were the preliminary commercial loan applications Blake had attempted to force upon her. I highlighted the sections where Blake had already initiated the forgery of her signature to establish fraudulent credit lines. He had systematically weaponized her architectural firm to absorb the lethal consequences of his own degenerate gambling. He was actively attempting to bankrupt her entirely, to buy himself a few more weeks of miserable survival. The sheer velocity of the evidence shattered her psychological defenses. The protective walls she had built around her marriage collapsed entirely. She reached out and touched the forged signatures, tracing the jagged ink of a man who intended to destroy her completely. Sydney buried her face in her hands and began to weep with a profound, visceral agony. She wept for the total destruction of her future. She wept for the absolute violation of her trust. She wept for the man she mistakenly believed loved her. Through the harsh, racking sobs tearing through her chest, she clung to one final desperate fragment of denial. She looked up, her face wet with tears, and insisted that her mother would never allow this to happen. She swore that Valerie would have intervened, that Valerie would have protected her if she had known the true depth of Blake's depravity. The absolute purity of her filial trust made my next action incredibly painful yet militarily necessary. A partial extraction is a failed extraction. The infection had to be eradicated entirely. I picked up the small remote control resting in the center of the conference table and pressed the primary activation button. The concealed surround sound speakers hummed to life, projecting the crystal-clear digital audio I had recorded from the dark window of my mansion. Blake's unhinged, screaming voice filled the pristine corporate room, violently detailing his massive debts and his plotted assault. Then Valerie's voice cut through the air. Instead of defending her daughter, my wife engaged in a vicious, mocking dialogue about Sydney's fundamental naivety. Valerie coldly complained about the inconvenience of dragging Sydney's limp, drugged body to the ink pad. She degraded Sydney's intelligence, reducing her brilliant, hardworking daughter to a pathetic, gullible stepping stone. The recording played loudly, laying bare the absolute core of their treason. Every vicious syllable they had spat in the driveway resonated through the office, severing the final tether connecting Sydney to her toxic mother. The undeniable sound of Valerie's betrayal completely saturated the room. The transformation within my daughter was instantaneous and terrifying to behold. The heavy, racking sobs abruptly ceased. The tears stopped. The trembling stopped. The paralyzing confusion stopped. A deadly, absolute silence descended upon her. She sat perfectly still in the leather chair, staring blankly at the dark speakers as the final echo of her mother's voice faded away. The raw, debilitating grief evaporated from her eyes, instantly replaced by a cold, crystalline fury. The brilliant, meticulous architect who built skyscrapers from raw steel re-emerged harder and sharper than ever before. She did not scream. She did not throw the binder. She calmly reached across the glass table, locked her gaze completely with mine, and extended her steady hand. She asked me for a pen. Her voice carried the absolute, unwavering 0-degree temperature of a woman preparing to burn an empire to the ground. Fletcher silently materialized beside her, sliding a thick stack of finalized divorce decrees and emergency corporate injunctions onto the table. Sydney clicked the silver pen and began signing the heavy parchment. She signed her name with brutal, slashing strokes, legally decapitating Blake's access to her wealth and executing the permanent freezing of her entire asset portfolio. The counteroffensive had officially begun. Sydney's transformation from shattered victim to avenging force was magnificent, but raw fury is a dangerously volatile fuel. The ink was barely dry on the legal injunctions before the sheer, overwhelming adrenaline took hold of her nervous system. She wanted to storm out of Fletcher's corporate office immediately. She wanted to drive directly back to the suburban house where Blake was likely counting the hours. She wanted to hurl the photographic evidence of the loan sharks directly into his arrogant face. She wanted to tear down the entire facade right that very second. Her hands clenched into tight, bloodless fists as she paced the length of the conference room, her heels clicking a frantic, aggressive rhythm against the polished floor. I stepped directly into her path, placing both of my hands firmly on her trembling shoulders, acting as the physical anchor she desperately needed. I looked into her burning eyes and taught her the absolute, uncompromising rule of asymmetrical warfare. I told her that anger is a tactical weapon only when it is buried under a layer of absolute ice. I told her that we never under any circumstances interrupt the enemy when they are in the exact middle of making a catastrophic mistake. Blake believed he had secured his financial salvation. He believed he held the absolute upper hand. To confront him now, fueled by unpredictable emotional rage, would give him a desperate window to react, to flee, or to retaliate. I explained that true vengeance is not a sudden chaotic explosion. True vengeance is a meticulously engineered demolition. I needed her to swallow the burning acid in her throat. I needed her to go home. I needed her to look the man who betrayed her in the eye and smile perfectly, maintaining the illusion until the guillotine blade was locked firmly into position. Fletcher moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of a legal executioner. The moment Sydney agreed to the tactical delay, my attorney gathered the signed divorce decrees and the emergency asset injunctions, securing them within his leather briefcase. He bypassed the standard sluggish clerical channels, entirely leveraging decades of high-level judicial connections to file the documents directly with a sympathetic district judge under a strict, impenetrable judicial seal. This specific legal maneuver was absolutely paramount to our strategy. The judicial seal guaranteed that Blake would receive absolutely no premature automated notifications. He would not receive an email alert. He would not receive a text message from his bank. He would remain entirely blind to the legal decapitation that had just occurred. While Blake was celebrating his supposed victory with the loan sharks, Fletcher was systematically transferring the entirety of Sydney's personal wealth, her corporate equity, her real estate holdings, and her liquid capital into a highly secured, untouchable holding company. This financial fortress was completely isolated from her marriage, operating under a corporate charter that explicitly locked out any spousal claims. I sat in Fletcher's office watching the digital confirmations roll across his encrypted monitor. The massive joint accounts Blake believed he could drain were drained for him, legally diverted into the heavily fortified trust. The commercial properties Blake believed he could leverage were legally stripped of his name. The business licenses Blake believed he could manipulate were permanently nullified. We stripped him of his financial armor layer by layer, document by document, signature by signature. By the time Fletcher closed his laptop, the legal reality was absolute and utterly devastating. Every single safety net he thought he had carefully woven had been cleanly severed by Fletcher's legal scalpel. The $500,000 debt he had just aggressively incurred from my shadow subsidiary was now hanging solely around his own neck, completely detached from Sydney's assets. He owned nothing. He controlled nothing. He possessed nothing. He commanded nothing. The man who had sold his soul to Apex Capital, betting his entire future on my daughter's hard-earned architectural empire, was now floating in an absolute financial vacuum. We had constructed a flawless, invisible cage around his entire existence, and he was currently sitting inside it, entirely convinced he was the master of his own destiny. With the legal snare perfectly secured, I returned to the mansion to orchestrate the final spectacular stage of their execution. Tomorrow marked the exact date of my 40th wedding anniversary. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a quiet, reflective milestone, but Valerie had long ago transformed the date into an aggressive display of high society dominance. This year, her desperation to project absolute superiority was completely amplified by the terrifying reality of her severed bank accounts. After experiencing the humiliating rejection of her platinum credit cards earlier that afternoon, Valerie's panic had mutated into a frantic, manic need to maintain appearances. She could not afford to cancel the massive catered anniversary gala she had orchestrated months in advance. She needed the applause. She needed the envy. She needed the illusion of limitless wealth to mask the horrifying financial void she was currently tumbling into. Having absolutely zero access to my capital, Valerie turned her venomous demands entirely onto Blake. She cornered her parasitic lover, furiously demanding that he leverage his newly acquired supposed warehouse wealth to cover the massive catering invoices, the imported floral arrangements, and the premium champagne deliveries. Blake, riding the absolute high of his false victory and eager to appease the woman he believed was about to inherit my entire estate, foolishly complied. He transferred tens of thousands of dollars from his Apex Capital loan directly to Valerie's high-end vendors. He was actively financing his own magnificent downfall. I watched the frantic preparations unfold from the quiet shadows of my study. I watched them drape the dining room in expensive silk. I watched them arrange crystal centerpieces. I watched them construct the exact opulent stage where their complete destruction would be broadcast to the entire city. At precisely 7 o'clock the following evening, the fleet of professional caterers descended upon the estate. The mansion quickly filled with the intoxicating scent of roasted meats and the bright, rhythmic chatter of Atlanta's local elite. Wealthy investors, prominent politicians, and high society socialites drifted through the grand corridors, clutching flutes of expensive champagne financed entirely by Blake's ruinous debt. Valerie floated down the grand staircase in a stunning, custom-tailored emerald gown, radiating a forced, brittle confidence as she greeted her wealthy peers. Blake stood perfectly positioned by the extravagant bar, wearing a tailored tuxedo, flawlessly playing the role of the devoted, highly successful son-in-law. They both smiled for the flashing cameras. They both toasted to my supposed legacy. They both basked in the glittering, expensive lie they had constructed. I stood in the heavy oak doorway of my private study, observing the glittering spectacle unfolding in my living room. I slowly buttoned my jacket. I meticulously straightened my silk tie. The trap was set. The audience was seated. The curtain was rising. The agonizing silent adjustment of the past several months was officially over, and the absolute destruction of their lives was about to become permanently, irrevocably deafening. Sydney's transformation from a shattered victim into an avenging force was magnificent, but raw, unrefined fury is a dangerously volatile fuel. The black ink on the emergency injunctions was barely dry before the sheer, overwhelming adrenaline completely hijacked her nervous system. She demanded her car keys from Fletcher, insisting she was going to drive directly back to the suburban house where Blake was likely celebrating his perceived victory. She wanted to hurl the photographic evidence of the armed loan sharks directly into his arrogant face. She wanted to tear down his entire fabricated reality right that very second. She wanted to scream until her lungs burned. Her hands clenched into tight, bloodless fists as she paced the length of the conference room, her heels clicking a frantic, aggressive rhythm against the polished glass floor. I stepped directly into her path, acting as the physical anchor she desperately needed. I placed both of my hands firmly on her trembling shoulders and locked my gaze completely with hers. I taught her the absolute uncompromising rule of asymmetrical warfare. I told her that anger is a tactical weapon only when it is buried under a layer of absolute ice. I ordered her to never under any circumstances interrupt the enemy when they are in the exact middle of making a catastrophic mistake. Blake genuinely believed he had secured his financial salvation. To confront him now, fueled by unpredictable emotional rage, would grant him a desperate window to react, to flee the state, or to retaliate violently. I explained that true vengeance is not a sudden, chaotic explosion, but a meticulously engineered demolition. I needed her to swallow the burning acid in her throat, look the man who betrayed her in the eye, and maintain the illusion flawlessly until the guillotine blade was locked firmly into position. Fletcher moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of a seasoned legal executioner. The moment Sydney agreed to the tactical delay, my attorney gathered the signed divorce decrees and the emergency asset injunctions, securing them within his heavy leather briefcase. He bypassed the standard sluggish clerical channels, entirely leveraging decades of high-level judicial connections to file the documents directly with a sympathetic district judge. He placed the entire legal maneuver under a strict, impenetrable judicial seal. This specific procedural lock was absolutely paramount to our strategy. The judicial seal guaranteed that Blake would receive absolutely no premature automated notifications from the court system. He would not receive a warning email alert. He would not receive a text message from his personal bank. He would remain entirely blind to the catastrophic legal decapitation that had just occurred. While Blake was likely celebrating his supposed warehouse victory with the loan sharks, Fletcher was systematically transferring the entirety of Sydney's personal wealth, her corporate equity, her massive real estate holdings, and her liquid capital into a highly secured, untouchable holding company. This financial fortress was completely isolated from her marriage, operating under a specialized corporate charter that explicitly locked out any spousal claims or debt obligations. I sat in Fletcher's office, watching the digital confirmations roll across his encrypted monitor one by one. The massive joint accounts Blake believed he could drain were drained for him, legally diverted into the heavily fortified trust. The commercial properties Blake believed he could leverage were legally stripped of his name. The business licenses Blake believed he could manipulate were permanently nullified. We stripped him of his financial armor, layer by layer, document by document, signature by signature. By the time Fletcher finally closed his laptop, the legal reality was absolute and utterly devastating. Every single safety net Blake thought he had carefully woven had been cleanly severed by Fletcher's legal scalpel. The massive $500,000 debt he had just aggressively incurred from my shadow subsidiary was now hanging solely around his own neck, completely detached from Sydney's pristine assets. He owned nothing. He controlled nothing. He possessed nothing. The man who had bet his entire future on my daughter's hard-earned architectural empire was now floating in an absolute financial vacuum, entirely convinced he was the master of his own destiny. With the legal snare perfectly secured, I returned to the mansion to orchestrate the final spectacular stage of their execution. Tomorrow marked the exact date of my 40th wedding anniversary. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a quiet, reflective milestone, but Valerie had long ago transformed the date into an aggressive display of high society dominance. This year, her desperation to project absolute superiority was completely amplified by the terrifying reality of her newly severed bank accounts. After experiencing the humiliating rejection of her platinum credit cards earlier that afternoon, Valerie's panic had mutated into a frantic, manic need to maintain appearances at all costs. She could not afford to cancel the massive catered anniversary gala she had orchestrated months in advance. She needed the applause of her peers. She needed the envy of her rivals. She needed the illusion of limitless wealth to mask the horrifying financial void she was currently tumbling into. Having absolutely zero access to my capital, Valerie turned her venomous demands entirely onto Blake. She cornered her parasitic lover in the hallway, furiously demanding that he leverage his newly acquired supposed warehouse wealth to cover the massive catering invoices, the imported floral arrangements, and the premium champagne deliveries. Blake, riding the absolute high of his false victory and eager to appease the woman he believed was about to inherit my entire estate, foolishly complied. He transferred tens of thousands of dollars from his Apex Capital loan directly to Valerie's high-end vendors. He was actively financing his own magnificent downfall. I watched the frantic preparations unfold from the quiet shadows of my study, observing them construct the exact opulent stage where their complete destruction would be broadcast to the entire city. At precisely 7 o'clock the following evening, the fleet of professional caterers descended upon the estate. The mansion quickly filled with the intoxicating scent of roasted meats and the bright rhythmic chatter of Atlanta's local elite. Wealthy investors, prominent politicians, and high society socialites drifted through the grand corridors clutching flutes of expensive champagne financed entirely by Blake's ruinous, inescapable debt. Valerie floated down the grand staircase in a stunning, custom-tailored emerald gown radiating a forced, brittle confidence as she enthusiastically greeted her wealthy peers. Blake stood perfectly positioned by the extravagant marble bar, wearing a tailored tuxedo, flawlessly playing the role of the devoted, highly successful son-in-law. They both smiled brightly for the flashing cameras. They both raised their expensive glasses to toast my supposed legacy. They both basked in the glittering, expensive lie they had constructed together. I stood in the heavy oak doorway of my private study, observing the glittering spectacle unfolding in my living room. I slowly buttoned my jacket. I meticulously straightened my silk tie. The trap was definitively set. The long, agonizing period of silent adjustment was officially over. Tonight, the silence was about to become absolutely deafening. The motorized hum of the massive projector screen descending from the vaulted ceiling cut through the polite applause of the ballroom. Valerie stood frozen under the crystal chandelier, her face arranged into the perfect mask of a blushing, devoted wife, anticipating a montage of fabricated nostalgia. The local elite raised their champagne flutes, expecting a curated slideshow of sepia-toned wedding photographs and pristine family vacations. I held the small remote control with absolute stillness, feeling the cold plastic press into my palm as the projector cast a blinding beam of pure white light across the darkened room. The screen did not display our wedding day. It did not show Valerie holding a newborn Sydney. Instead, the brilliant projection flickered and resolved into a pristine, high-definition video I had recorded through the frosted window of our secluded mountain cabin exactly 3 weeks ago. The vibrant colors of the ballroom were instantly washed out by the stark, undeniable visual of my wife and my son-in-law tangled together in the dimly lit cabin interior. The guests leaned forward, their polite smiles faltering as their brains struggled to process the explicit, deeply intimate framing of the footage. Valerie's emerald gown suddenly looked like a heavy shroud as she stared up at the massive 10-foot projection of her own devastating infidelity. The visual clarity was absolute and unforgiving. Every shadowy corner of the cabin, every stolen touch, every manifestation of their clandestine affair was broadcast in cinematic resolution to the wealthiest and most influential citizens of Atlanta. The carefully constructed illusion of my 40-year marriage dissolved instantly into the ether, replaced by the towering, undeniable reality of a spectacular and venomous betrayal. The visual shock was immediately weaponized by the crystal-clear surround sound audio that suddenly flooded the mansion's grand living room. The acoustics of the space designed to amplify classical quartets and joyful toasts now carried the heavy, breathless voices of Blake and Valerie into the ears of every single guest. Blake's voice echoed off the marble pillars, completely stripped of his usual polished corporate charm. His tone was raw, predatory, and dripping with naked greed. He pressed Valerie against the wooden frame of the cabin bed and explicitly demanded to know the exact location of the stolen safe key. The audio captured every wet, sickening sound of their intimacy as Blake outlined his precise timeline to drain my offshore accounts. He systematically detailed their grand strategy to rob the family blind, laughing with cruel, unrestrained arrogance about how easily they had manipulated my supposed blind trust. He mocked my age, dismissing me as a decaying artifact standing between them and absolute financial supremacy. Valerie's recorded voice replied with equal venom, her words slicing through the frozen ballroom like a scythe. She coldly reassured her parasitic lover that she had successfully copied the master key and disabled the secondary alarm protocols. She bragged about feeding Sydney fabricated lies to keep her daughter distracted while they hollowed out the foundation of the estate. The horrific clarity of the recording left absolutely zero room for misinterpretation or denial. They discussed the specific routing numbers of the international wire transfers and laughed about leaving Sydney entirely bankrupt and legally liable for the fallout. The guests stood paralyzed, their champagne flutes hovering in midair as they listened to the undeniable proof of a massive multi-layered criminal conspiracy. Blake's voice reverberated from the hidden speakers, laying out the exact mechanics of the warehouse fraud and explicitly confirming his intention to steal the $3 million payout. It was a flawless, self-executed confession broadcast at maximum volume to a room full of federal judges, senior bank executives, and ruthless socialites. The intimate betrayal was agonizing, but the detailed financial treason transformed the video from a mere scandal into a documented federal crime. Every whispered promise of destruction, every shared laugh over Sydney's impending ruin, and every calculated step of their extortion plot crashed over the audience like a tidal wave of toxic sludge. The room was forced to swallow the vile reality that the glittering hosts of this lavish anniversary gala were nothing more than common thieves dressed in stolen couture. As the recording faded into a static hiss and the massive screen went entirely black, the silence in the room became absolute and completely suffocating. The rhythmic breathing of 100 paralyzed guests was the only sound vibrating through the heavy air. The social elite of Atlanta stood frozen in a collective state of pure, unadulterated shock. The spell was violently broken by the sharp ringing crash of a crystal champagne flute slipping from a stunned banker's hand and shattering into 1,000 glittering shards against the polished marble floor. The sharp noise snapped the room back into reality. Valerie's perfectly contoured face drained of all blood, transforming into a horrifying, ashen mask of total defeat. The arrogant, triumphant monarch who had spent the entire morning aggressively ordering the demolition of my home simply ceased to exist. Her knees buckled beneath the weight of her heavy emerald gown. She collapsed onto the hard marble, her manicured hands clawing frantically at her own throat as she gasped for air in a severe, debilitating panic attack. She looked wildly around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face, but found only pure repulsion. The guests immediately began turning their backs on her. Federal judges, elite investors, and lifelong socialite friends moved in a synchronized wave of sheer disgust, silently marching toward the grand oak exit doors. No one offered to help her stand. No one offered a word of comfort. They stepped carefully around her trembling, gasping form as if she were a highly contagious disease. The glittering high society she had worshipped and bled for was permanently excommunicating her without uttering a single syllable. The absolute rejection was a physical blow, leaving her utterly isolated on the floor of the mansion she had so desperately tried to steal. While Valerie drowned in her public execution, Blake's toxic survival instinct violently kicked into overdrive. He refused to accept his absolute destruction. He lunged into the center of the emptying room, his tuxedo jacket riding up as he frantically waved his arms to halt the retreating crowd. He shouted with a panicked, unhinged volume, desperately claiming the video was a sophisticated AI deepfake. He screamed that the entire presentation was a ridiculous manufactured smear campaign designed by a jealous, decaying old man to ruin his flawless reputation. His voice cracked with manic desperation as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. He dropped the facade of the loving son-in-law completely, his face twisted into a mask of feral rage. He declared with absolute blinding arrogance that he was still the sole legal broker of the massive warehouse deal. He roared that he possessed the binding contracts and the unassailable corporate authority to execute the $3 million transaction. He promised the remaining guests that he would destroy me in federal court, swearing to completely bankrupt my estate and drag my name through the mud. I stood in the center of the silent ballroom, completely unbothered by Blake's frantic, spit-flying tirade. He was a drowning man swinging at the ocean, utterly blind to the undertow pulling him down. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I did not offer a single word in my own defense, nor did I entertain his pathetic claims of artificial intelligence and fabricated smear campaigns. Anger is a weapon of the weak, and I had long ago buried my fury beneath a glacier of calculated patience. I simply kept my eyes locked on his flushed, sweating face and raised my right hand, making a slow, deliberate gesture toward the grand double doors of the foyer. The remaining guests parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, unobstructed path. The heavy oak doors swung open. Fletcher strode into the opulent living room, his polished leather shoes echoing against the marble with the grim finality of a ticking clock. He was not alone. Flanking my attorney were two heavily armed, uniformed police officers from the local precinct, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Directly behind them walked a stern, unsmiling federal marshal wearing a dark tactical windbreaker and carrying a thick stack of official warrants. The sheer, overwhelming presence of law enforcement instantly extinguished the remaining oxygen in the room. Blake's furious screaming died in his throat, replaced by a ragged, wet gasp of sheer terror. He stumbled backward, colliding heavily against the edge of the catered buffet table. The aggressive posture he had maintained just seconds prior shattered entirely. He looked from the federal marshal to the police officers, and finally to Fletcher, his eyes wide with the sudden paralyzing realization that the game was not just over, but that the board itself had been rigged from the very beginning. Fletcher walked directly to the center of the room and dropped a massive black leather binder onto the antique dining table. The heavy thud resonated through the dead silence of the mansion like a gavel striking a block. He did not address Valerie, who was still weeping silently on the floor, nor did he look at the remaining stunned guests. He locked his cold, analytical gaze entirely on Blake. Fletcher unclasped the binder and laid out the absolute architecture of Blake's destruction. He spoke with clinical, devastating precision, stripping away the final layers of Blake's manufactured reality. He announced that the highly lucrative $3 million commercial warehouse deal in the industrial district had never existed. It was a meticulously crafted phantom, a piece of architectural bait engineered entirely by my primary blind trust to trigger Blake's insatiable greed. The prospective buyers, the offshore investors, the relentless email threads, and the pressurized closing deadlines were all fabricated components of a carefully controlled simulation. Blake stared at the legal documents, his jaw trembling as the horrifying truth began to penetrate his panic. Fletcher then turned a page and delivered the lethal strike. He presented the loan agreement Blake had signed less than 24 hours ago in a desperate bid to secure his fraudulent surety bond. Fletcher reminded him of Apex Capital, the shadowy high-risk lending firm that had eagerly handed over $500,000 to save Blake from the violent loan sharks. Fletcher pushed the corporate registry documents across the smooth mahogany wood. He explicitly outlined the ownership hierarchy, tracing the shell companies and holding firms directly back to their source. Apex Capital was not an independent financial savior. It was a private subsidiary 100% owned and operated by my own estate. I had personally authorized the bridge loan. I had provided the rope, and Blake had eagerly wrapped it around his own neck. He had borrowed my money to fund a fake transaction designed to steal my wealth, and in doing so, he had willingly handed over the absolute legal rights to his entire existence. The blood completely drained from Blake's face as he realized he had been negotiating with a mirror entirely manipulated by the very man he sought to destroy. Fletcher did not give him a single second to breathe. He immediately pulled out the signed collateral agreements and began reading the ruthless terms of default aloud. He highlighted the specific clauses Blake had ignored in his desperate rush for capital. By securing the Apex Capital bridge loan using fabricated financial statements and forged surety bonds, Blake had committed undeniable documented corporate fraud. That singular fatal error triggered an immediate irreversible default on the entire $500,000 principal. Fletcher slapped the executed seizure orders onto the table, stacking them up like tombstones. He informed Blake that the asset liquidation had already begun while he was busy drinking my champagne. Apex Capital was currently exercising its absolute legal right to seize his entire boutique investment firm. His corporate accounts were frozen. His luxury vehicles were flagged for immediate repossession by private recovery agents. His personal banking portfolios, already severely depleted by his degenerate gambling addiction, were now entirely locked under a comprehensive federal lien. Fletcher detailed how every single piece of property Blake claimed to own was now the exclusive legal property of my trust. He was being stripped down to the very clothes on his back. Blake gasped for air, clutching the edge of the table to keep from collapsing alongside Valerie. He stammered, attempting to formulate a cohesive legal defense, but the words failed him. He was staring down the barrel of total, inescapable financial annihilation. There were no loopholes left to exploit, no hidden accounts to drain, and no gullible family members left to manipulate. The trap had closed, with mechanical perfection crushing his future into unrecognizable dust. He was utterly ruined, legally dismantled by the very paperwork he believed would guarantee his permanent supremacy. The federal marshal stepped forward, breaking the frozen tableau. He did not ask for permission, and he did not offer a polite warning. He moved with swift, uncompromising authority, grabbing Blake firmly by the shoulder and spinning him around to face the wall. He informed Blake that the complete financial bankruptcy was only the civil consequence of his actions. The marshal loudly declared that Blake was officially under arrest for multiple counts of felony wire fraud, severe corporate embezzlement, and a documented conspiracy to commit extortion against his own family. The charges carried mandatory federal minimums that would ensure he spent the next 2 decades behind reinforced concrete. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked sharply around Blake's sweating wrists, the metallic snap echoing through the silent mansion like the closing of a vault door. He offered no physical resistance, completely paralyzed by the sheer velocity of his downfall. The uniformed officers stepped in, flanking him on both sides, preparing to march him out the front door and into the waiting transport vehicle. I stood by the fireplace, straightening my silk tie, completely untouched by the carnage I had meticulously engineered. The execution was absolute. The cold metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists shattered the last remaining fragment of Blake's composure. The terrifying reality of a 20-year federal prison sentence instantly dissolved any lingering trace of his manufactured loyalty. Like a cornered rat trapped in the hull of a rapidly sinking ship, his base survival instinct violently overrode his affection for his wealthy mistress. He violently twisted his torso against the firm grip of the uniformed police officers and completely turned on the woman he had just been kissing. He screamed across the silent, cavernous living room, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic as he aimed his shackled wrist directly at Valerie, who was still gasping on the cold marble floor. He wildly accused her of orchestrating the entire criminal enterprise from the very beginning. He shouted to the federal marshal that he was nothing more than a helpless pawn, a victim of a predatory older woman who had masterminded the extortion plot to fund her lavish lifestyle. He detailed with frantic, breathless desperation how Valerie had personally stolen the master safe key from my private study. He explicitly claimed she had threatened to completely destroy his boutique investment firm if he did not comply with her toxic demands to seduce and trick Sydney into signing the loan documents. He painted himself as a terrified hostage forced into a corner by a manipulative, power-hungry matriarch who wanted to bleed her own family dry for her personal amusement. He threw Valerie entirely under the speeding wheels of federal justice, hoping the sheer velocity of his accusations would somehow buy him a shred of leniency from the authorities. He begged the officers to check her personal offshore bank accounts, swearing that she was the true architect of the warehouse fraud and that he was merely following her destructive directives. Valerie's tear-stained eyes snapped wide open, the shock of Blake's immediate brutal betrayal temporarily overriding her paralyzing panic attack. The absolute sheer audacity of his accusations ignited a desperate feral rage within her shattered ego. She dragged herself up onto her hands and knees, the heavy emerald silk of her custom anniversary gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She shrieked back at him, her voice a ragged, ear-piercing weapon that echoed terribly off the crystal chandeliers above. She called him a parasitic, opportunistic liar, a pathetic corporate fraud who had been drowning in illegal gambling debts long before he ever set foot inside our home. She screamed that he had actively preyed upon her loneliness, systematically isolating her from her husband and her daughter to gain unfettered access to the estate's massive capital reserves. The venomous exchange between the two former lovers was a spectacular display of mutual destruction, a public, highly audible autopsy of a relationship built entirely on shared greed and toxic ambition. Realizing very quickly that screaming at a handcuffed felon would not save her from the impending legal slaughter, Valerie abruptly shifted her tactical approach. She turned her makeup-smeared face toward me. The arrogant high society queen was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, desperate woman facing the absolute collapse of her opulent empire. She literally crawled across the polished floor, dragging herself toward my shoes in front of the stunned crowd. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands and grabbed the perfectly pressed hem of my trousers, weeping with loud, racking sobs. She begged for my forgiveness, her voice completely saturated with a pathetic, manufactured remorse. She claimed she had been completely brainwashed, emotionally manipulated, and psychologically abused by a younger predatory man who had taken vicious advantage of her vulnerability. She swore she still loved me, that she had always loved me, and that this was merely a temporary, catastrophic lapse in judgment. She pleaded for a second chance, promising to spend the rest of her life making amends for the temporary insanity that had infected her mind, clinging to my leg and performing the role of the tragic, manipulated wife with every ounce of theatrical desperation she could summon from her hollow core. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a single gesture of comfort, anger, or recognition. I looked down at the weeping, trembling woman clinging to my trousers with an expression of absolute zero-degree emptiness. There was no fury left in my chest, only the cold, mechanical precision of an architect executing a final authorized demolition order. I smoothly stepped backward, firmly dislodging her manicured hands from my clothing, leaving her grasping at the empty air. I reached into the inside breast pocket of my tailored jacket and retrieved a single neatly folded document printed on heavy watermarked parchment. I knelt slightly, maintaining my strict emotional distance, and dropped the paper directly onto the marble floor in front of her tear-stained face. I calmly instructed her to read the highlighted section. It was not a standard divorce petition. It was a heavily fortified post-nuptial nullification clause. I explained, my voice echoing evenly across the utterly silent room, that she had unknowingly signed this exact addendum 5 years ago during a massive corporate tax restructuring process. She had been far too preoccupied with planning a summer gala to actually read the fine print her lawyers had hastily approved. The ironclad clause explicitly stipulated that any documented proven act of infidelity immediately and permanently stripped her of any and all claims to my estate, my liquid assets, my commercial properties, and my corporate equity. The clause was absolute, designed specifically to bypass the standard messy divorce courts and execute a clean, immediate financial severance. I informed her that the high-definition video of her cabin betrayal had already been legally authenticated and officially attached to the executed addendum. She was no longer a wealthy socialite entitled to half an empire. She was legally entirely destitute. Before Valerie could even process the sheer magnitude of her instantaneous bankruptcy, Fletcher stepped forward to deliver the final, crushing blow. My attorney looked down at her with pure professional disdain and informed her that the financial severance was merely the civil resolution to her treason. Fletcher produced a final stamped police report detailing the exact serial numbers of my vintage Patek Philippe watches. He informed her that her frantic, desperate transaction at the downtown pawn shop earlier that week constituted undeniable felony grand larceny. He held the documented evidence of her fencing stolen property a severe crime carrying mandatory prison time. Fletcher's voice remained perfectly level as he delivered the ultimate condition of her survival. He stated that I had absolutely no desire to endure a prolonged, messy public trial for the entertainment of the local media. I would generously decline to press federal criminal charges and hand the pawn shop security footage over to the district attorney on one absolute non-negotiable condition. She had exactly 30 minutes to pack a single suitcase with her basic personal clothing. She was expressly forbidden from taking any jewelry, fine art, or any asset purchased with my capital. She had 30 minutes to walk out the front door and vanish from my life forever, or she would immediately join Blake in the back of the federal transport vehicle. The uniformed officers tightened their grip on Blake's arms, their sheer physical force finally breaking his momentary paralysis. As they began to physically drag his struggling frame toward the heavy oak double doors of the foyer, the desperate reality of his impending incarceration completely overwhelmed his manufactured bravado. His highly polished leather shoes scuffed frantically against the immaculate marble floor, desperately trying to find purchase to slow the inevitable march to the waiting federal transport vehicle. Through the chaotic blur of flashing badges and stern faces, his wild, darting eyes finally locked onto Sydney. She stood perfectly still near the grand staircase, her posture radiating an impenetrable icy calm that starkly contrasted with his complete unraveling. The sight of his wife instantly triggered his deeply ingrained parasitic survival mechanism. He snapped back into the role of the unjustly persecuted husband, his voice breaking into a loud, pathetic wail that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He screamed her name wildly, accusing the federal marshal of a massive misunderstanding and begging her to intervene immediately. He cried out, tears of genuine panic streaming down his flushed face, demanding that she contact the city's top defense attorneys right that very second. He shamelessly begged her to liquidate whatever assets were necessary from her architectural firm, pleading with her to use her corporate capital to secure his bail. He promised her that he could explain everything, that the video was a malicious fabrication, and that they needed to stand united against her father's tyrannical sabotage. His voice was a sickening symphony of emotional manipulation, frantically trying to play the exact same chords of guilt and duty that he had successfully weaponized against her for their entire marriage, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman he was begging for salvation was the primary architect of his destruction. Sydney did not flinch, nor did she rush to his side to offer the comforting embrace he so desperately demanded. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator who had successfully cornered her prey. The chaotic energy of the foyer seemed to part around her as she walked calmly toward the struggling man she had once promised to spend her life with. She did not display a single ounce of the weeping, shattered vulnerability he had expected. Instead, her eyes were completely devoid of warmth, reflecting only the harsh, uncompromising light of the crystal chandelier. The police officers paused their forward momentum for a brief second, allowing the betrayed wife to address the handcuffed felon. Sydney reached into her sleek leather purse and smoothly extracted a heavy, folded document bound by a thick legal seal. She stepped directly into Blake's personal space, close enough to smell the terrified sweat radiating from his skin. With a steady, unhurried motion, she slid the finalized, legally binding divorce decree directly into the breast pocket of his expensive tuxedo jacket. She locked her gaze with his wide, frantic eyes and spoke in a low, perfectly even tone that cut through his pathetic whimpering like a surgical blade. She informed him with absolute 0-degree temperature that her architectural firm was entirely fortified, operating under an emergency injunction that rendered her corporate and personal assets completely untouchable by him or his creditors. She watched the last remaining spark of hope extinguish in his eyes as she systematically dismantled his final illusion of control. She then delivered the ultimate devastating payload. She leaned in slightly and informed him that she had not just severed their marriage, but she had spent the entire morning compiling every single piece of his fraudulent banking documentation, his forged commercial loan applications, and his illegal offshore betting receipts. She confirmed that a comprehensive digital dossier of his massive financial discrepancies had already been successfully transmitted to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. She had legally entirely weaponized his own degeneracy against him, ensuring that even if he somehow survived the federal extortion charges, the absolute weight of federal tax evasion would bury him forever. She stepped back, her expression a mask of flawless, terrifying serenity, entirely unaffected by the total catastrophic ruin of the man standing before her. The sheer velocity of Sydney's absolute rejection shattered whatever fragile psychological scaffolding Blake had left. He broke down completely, his knees buckling as a guttural, animalistic sob tore through his chest. The officers did not offer him a moment to process the total annihilation of his future. They hauled his limp, weeping body through the grand double doors and out into the cool night air. The strobing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted his horrified face in harsh, alternating colors, permanently documenting his spectacular fall from grace as he was violently shoved into the back of the federal transport vehicle. Simultaneously, another brutal reality was unfolding just beyond the imposing stone columns of the mansion. Valerie dragged a single hastily packed leather suitcase down the long, winding cobblestone driveway. The sharp gravel chewed up the heels of her expensive designer shoes as she stumbled into the darkness, entirely stripped of the opulent empire she had tried to steal. She held her cell phone with trembling, manicured hands, frantically attempting to hail an Uber. The screen repeatedly flashed bright red, declining the transaction because every single platinum credit card attached to her digital wallet had been permanently canceled and legally flagged by my estate. She looked wildly toward the wrought iron security gates, desperately seeking a familiar face among the departing vehicles. The local politicians, the wealthy investors, and the high society socialites she had carefully cultivated for 4 decades drove past her in absolute silence. They kept their tinted windows rolled up, their headlights illuminating her pathetic, shivering form for only a fraction of a second before accelerating into the night. She was completely abandoned, exiled from the only world she valued, left to freeze in the agonizing realization of her absolute unmitigated ruin. The heavy federal transport vehicle shifted into gear, its tires crunching aggressively against the gravel as it carried Blake away toward the inescapable reality of a concrete cell. The blinding red and blue lights gradually faded into the distance, swallowed entirely by the dense suburban tree line. A few moments later, the taillights of the very last guest's luxury sedan vanished beyond the perimeter gates, leaving the massive estate completely isolated from the outside world. The frantic, chaotic energy that had violently saturated the anniversary gala evaporated, replaced by an absolute, profound stillness. I stood next to my daughter in the grand foyer, surrounded by the remnants of the glittering, expensive lie. Half-empty champagne flutes rested on marble tables, and abandoned silk napkins littered the pristine floor, silent testaments to the sudden, spectacular execution of a dual betrayal. The mansion was finally quiet. The toxic, parasitic infection that had silently rotted the foundation of our family had been surgically, permanently eradicated. The storm we had meticulously engineered had passed through the halls with terrifying precision. It left a brutal, uncompromising devastation in its immediate wake. But as I looked at the hardened, unyielding strength radiating from Sydney's posture, I knew the demolition was absolutely, undeniably necessary to build a reality based on truth. The grand living room resembled a beautiful abandoned battlefield. The expensive catered food cooled on silver platters entirely untouched. The crystal champagne flutes lay scattered across the tables like discarded casualties of a sudden war. I stood in the absolute center of the silent space, breathing in the scent of roasted meats and imported lilies that now felt entirely hollow. I did not ring the bell for the cleaning staff. I did not instruct the estate manager to begin clearing the wreckage of Valerie's extravagant lie. The physical mess could wait until tomorrow. The emotional debris required immediate, careful navigation. I turned away from the massive projection screen that had delivered the fatal strike and walked with measured, deliberate steps toward the mahogany bar. The bottles of top-tier liquor remained undisturbed, standing like glass sentinels in the shadows. I bypassed the celebratory champagne completely. I reached past the imported wines and wrapped my hand around the heavy neck of my oldest Kentucky bourbon. I poured the amber liquid directly into 2 heavy crystal tumblers, taking absolute care not to spill a single drop. The rich, smoky aroma of the aged bourbon grounded me, pulling me back from the adrenaline-fueled precipice of the evening's execution. I did not add ice. I did not add water. I wanted the burn. I needed the sharp, biting reality of the alcohol to wash away the lingering toxicity of the past several months. Carrying the 2 glasses, I walked past the empty dance floor, past the discarded emerald silk napkins, and pushed open the heavy French doors leading directly out to the expansive back patio. The cool night air immediately swept over my face, offering a clean, uncontaminated breath of absolute freedom. The soft, rhythmic click of Sydney's heels against the hardwood floor signaled her approach long before she stepped into the moonlight. She followed me through the open French doors, leaving the suffocating atmosphere of the ruined gala entirely behind her. She did not hesitate. She did not falter. She walked directly to my side and smoothly accepted the heavy crystal tumbler from my outstretched hand. The profound, agonizing devastation that had temporarily shattered her in Fletcher's corporate office was completely gone. The tears had stopped completely. The trembling had stopped completely. The blinding, paralyzing confusion had stopped completely. In their place stood a woman entirely forged in the fires of brutal clarity. Her posture was perfectly rigid, her spine aligned with an unyielding architectural strength that directly mirrored my own. She looked like a commanding general surveying the aftermath of a necessary, merciless purge. We moved in perfect, unspoken synchronization toward the edge of the stone patio, We lowered ourselves into the heavy, weathered teakwood Adirondack chairs that overlooked the sprawling, manicured lawn of the estate. The vast expanse of green grass stretched out toward the dark, impenetrable tree line, bathed in the pale silver glow of the midnight moon. We sat in total silence for several long minutes, allowing the profound stillness of the property to wash over us. The only sound was the gentle clinking of the ice-cold crystal against my wedding ring as I brought the glass to my lips. Sydney stared out at the dark horizon, her profile illuminated by the soft patio lights. She was absorbing the reality of her newfound liberation. She was processing the sheer, breathtaking velocity of Blake's removal from her existence. The man who had attempted to dismantle her brilliant career, the man who had actively leveraged her life to feed his degenerate gambling addiction, had been surgically excised from her world in a matter of hours. She raised the tumbler and took a slow, deliberate sip of the neat bourbon, embracing the harsh, burning sensation without flinching. Her eyes remained completely dry, reflecting a hardened, impenetrable resilience. She had survived the ambush. She had survived the treason. She had survived the total collapse of her personal life. She was no longer a victim waiting for the next blow. She was a survivor actively claiming her ground. Sydney lowered the crystal glass to the wide wooden armrest of her chair. She turned her head, fixing her piercing gaze directly upon my face. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was devoid of any residual shock, carrying only a deep, profound curiosity. She asked me how I had managed to endure the agonizing silence for so many weeks without exploding. She wanted to know how I had walked the same hallways as Valerie, how I had eaten at the same dining table, and how I had breathed the same air as the people actively plotting my total destruction without letting the rage consume me entirely. I looked back at my daughter, seeing the sharp, analytical mind of a master architect demanding a structural blueprint of my vengeance. I answered her with the absolute, unvarnished truth. I told her that true power does not reside in a sudden, violent strike. True power does not manifest in screaming matches, thrown glasses, or immediate emotional retaliation. I explained that reacting prematurely merely hands the enemy a weapon, giving them a desperate chance to adapt to lie or to escape the consequences of their treason. I told her that ultimate power lies in the terrifying patience required to let a liar build their own gallows. You do not interrupt them when they are gathering the wood. You do not correct them when they are tying the noose. You simply watch, you document, and you wait with absolute discipline until they confidently step onto the trapdoor of their own making. Valerie and Blake had possessed all the necessary rope to hang themselves. My only task was to ensure the knot was secure before I pulled the lever. The crisp, cool night air settled over the patio, sweeping away the last lingering remnants of the suffocating tension that had gripped the estate for months. The atmosphere felt incredibly clean, entirely purified by the absolute eradication of the threats that had surrounded us. The toxic elements had been violently, permanently excised from our lives. Valerie was gone, exiled into the dark, with nothing but a single suitcase and the terrifying reality of her own poverty. Blake was gone, currently sitting in a sterile federal holding cell, facing the absolute destruction of his freedom. The sprawling mansion behind us was empty, but it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a freshly cleared foundation, completely stripped of its rotting timber and prepared for a new, indestructible structure. I took one final sip of the burning bourbon and set the heavy glass down. I looked directly into Sydney's steady, unwavering eyes. I told her that the demolition phase of our operation was officially complete. I told her that tomorrow morning we would walk into her corporate headquarters together. Tomorrow we would systematically track down every single one of Blake's hidden debts. Tomorrow we start rebuilding the architectural firm. The early morning sun crested the Atlanta skyline, casting brilliant slashes of gold across the sleek glass facade of a newly acquired commercial tower in the heart of the downtown business district. This towering structure of steel and reinforced concrete was not a leased property or a leveraged asset vulnerable to the whims of shadow creditors. It was the heavily fortified permanent headquarters of Sydney's resurrected architectural firm. Over the past 6 months, the wreckage of Blake's parasitic infiltration had been entirely cleared, swept away to make room for a foundation built on absolute financial invulnerability. The corporate lease, the holding company, and every operational asset were now fully and irreversibly backed by the immense quiet power of my primary trust. Sydney stood in the center of the expansive main drafting floor, surrounded by teams of elite architects and junior designers moving with purposeful, synchronized energy. She navigated the room with lethal grace, authorizing million-dollar urban development projects and dismissing flawed proposals without a shred of hesitation. The raw, bleeding vulnerability that Blake had tried to exploit had been permanently sealed shut. She traced the lines of a massive structural blueprint stretched across her drafting table, her posture radiating an unbreakable, crystalline authority. The trauma of the anniversary gala had completely calcified into a relentless, driving ambition. She had systematically reclaimed every stolen client, aggressively renegotiated every compromised vendor contract, and expanded her corporate footprint with a ruthless efficiency that would have terrified the man who once thought he could manipulate her. She owned the space, commanding the floor not as a victim recovering from a catastrophic personal betrayal, but as a titan actively conquering her industry. The firm was no longer just an architectural venture. It was an impregnable fortress, financed by blood loyalty and engineered to withstand any external siege. Down in the pristine marble-lined lobby of the firm, a muted flat-screen television mounted above the reception desk silently broadcast the morning local news cycle. I paused by the elevator banks, my attention momentarily captured by the scrolling chyron flashing across the bottom of the glowing screen. The anchor's voice, crisp and objective, delivered the final legal epitaph of the man who had attempted to dismantle my bloodline. The federal courts had completely rejected Blake's frantic, tear-soaked pleas for leniency. The sheer volume of his documented financial crimes, coupled with the undeniable audio evidence of his extortion conspiracy, had left his high-priced defense attorneys entirely paralyzed. He had been officially sentenced to 5 mandatory years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, his arrogant corporate swagger permanently traded for the harsh, brutal reality of an orange jumpsuit and a heavily guarded concrete cell. He was officially categorized as a high-risk financial predator, ensuring his permanent exile from any legitimate sector of the American economy. The broadcast shifted to local politics, but my mind briefly navigated toward the other exiled traitor who had vanished into obscurity. Valerie's spectacular banishment had been equally absolute and arguably more agonizing. Stripped of her platinum credit cards, her coveted socialite status, and the vast protective umbrella of my wealth, she had fled the state in a state of utter humiliating disgrace. My private investigators had easily located her 2 months prior, living in a cramped, moldering one-bedroom apartment in a severely depressed Florida suburb. The woman who had once casually demanded imported silk and diamond tennis bracelets was currently enduring the grueling, soul-crushing reality of working as a minimum-wage retail clerk in a decaying discount clothing store. She spent her days folding cheap synthetic fabrics and suffering the daily indignities of rude, demanding customers completely alienated from the glittering high society world she had so desperately tried to steal. There were no more charity galas, no more catered dinners, and absolutely no more multi-million-dollar safety nets to catch her. She was trapped in the exact miserable, suffocating poverty she had always looked down upon with profound disgust. They had both aggressively dug their own graves, and the universe had simply obliged them by shoveling the heavy dirt. I stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it directly to the top floor, the polished steel doors sliding open to reveal Sydney's immaculate corner office. I was no longer wearing the comfortable, unassuming cardigans or the quiet, muted earth tones I had utilized to project the harmless illusion of a tired, aging patriarch. Today, I wore a sharply tailored, charcoal gray bespoke suit, my posture perfectly erect, reflecting the unyielding, ruthless intellect I had kept carefully concealed from the world for years. I walked across the plush carpet with the heavy, measured steps of a man who owned the very ground he walked upon. Sydney looked up from her desk as I entered, immediately setting down her silver pen. She did not greet me with the fragile, protective concern a daughter reserves for a vulnerable father. That dynamic had been permanently incinerated in the ashes of the mountain cabin. Instead, she stood up and walked around her massive mahogany desk, greeting me with the firm, respectful handshake of an absolute equal. We were no longer just father and daughter navigating the treacherous waters of family politics. We were highly synchronized business partners who had successfully executed a flawless defensive war against 2 domestic terrorists. She handed me the finalized quarterly projections, her voice steady and completely saturated with absolute confidence. We reviewed the dense financial numbers not as survivors of a profound tragedy, but as conquerors cataloging the spoils of a necessary brutal conflict. The mutual respect flowing between us was absolute, forged in the intense pressurized crucible of facing total destruction and emerging completely victorious. She had inherited my merciless clarity, and I had secured her absolute financial independence. I walked past Sydney's desk and stood before the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the sprawling grid of Atlanta, bathed in the bright, unforgiving light of the morning sun. The air inside the office was crisp, completely cleansed of the toxic parasitic infection that had once threatened to consume us entirely. The silent adjustment I had initiated months ago was now officially complete. It had been a brutal, cold, and entirely merciless process, stripped of all emotional hesitation. I had permanently lost a treacherous wife who viewed me as a decaying bank account, and I had eradicated a parasitic son-in-law who sought to feast on my family's legacy. But in executing their absolute destruction, I had secured the complete sovereignty of my empire. I had salvaged my daughter's brilliant future from the jaws of a predator, elevating her into an impenetrable fortress of her own making. The weak, rotting branches of my family tree had been violently pruned away, allowing the core to survive and thrive. The natural order had been flawlessly restored, built on an unshakable foundation of absolute truth and uncompromising strength. The profound silence that follows a necessary excision teaches a lesson far greater than the chaotic noise of betrayal. We are frequently conditioned to believe that preserving relationships is the ultimate measure of moral strength, even when those connections actively drain our resources, our energy, and our spirit. However, the true measure of wisdom lies in possessing the brutal clarity to recognize when a bond has transformed into a parasite. Love must never be a transaction disguised as an obligation. If affection requires constant financial maintenance, endless emotional concessions, and willful blindness to deceit, it is not love. It is simply a hostage situation masquerading as a partnership. The greatest tragedy is not the loss of a treacherous partner or a deceptive child. The true tragedy is spending decades financing your own destruction simply to maintain the comfortable illusion of family. Walking away from those who exploit you is not an act of cruelty. It is the purest form of personal salvation. When you permanently sever the ties that bind you to toxic individuals, you are not destroying a family. You are actively curing an infection. You must embrace the terrifying patience required to let manipulative people reveal their true nature. Allow them to build their own traps with their endless demands and arrogant assumptions. True power is never loud. It does not need to scream for attention or beg for validation. True power watches, calculates, and acts with mechanical precision only when the moment guarantees absolute victory. Forgiveness is a noble concept, but it should never be granted to those who view your kindness as a weakness to be exploited. Let the ashes of burned bridges fertilize the soil of your new reality. You have the absolute right to protect your peace, your assets, and your legacy with uncompromising force. Never apologize for establishing ironclad boundaries against those who feel entitled to the fruits of your labor. The air is always cleaner once the storm has washed the debris away. You will discover that standing alone with your dignity intact is infinitely superior to standing in a crowded room surrounded by smiling thieves. Rebuild your foundation on the solid rock of truth and let the parasites starve in the wilderness they created. Did you find resonance in this story of reclaiming power and flawless justice? Which city are you listening from? Let us meet in the comments below to discuss the boundaries we must draw in our lives. If you appreciated this narrative, please support the channel by sending a super thanks so I can continue bringing intense stories of survival just like this one. Your incredible support makes this content possible. I am looking forward to reading your insightful comments on this story. On your screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend you watch next. There is so much more engaging content on my channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with profound love and absolute respect.